He thought he was human. The system remembered otherwise. The station always smelled the same. Burnt wiring, cheap fuel, overheated metal, and just a hint of something sour that no one ever managed to track down or fix. It clung to everything, the walls, the tools, even your clothes, like the place itself didn't want to let you forget where you were. Not that I needed the reminder. I'd been working out of Dock Ring C for the better part of 6 years now, fixing whatever came through the doors for whoever could afford, just enough not to get turned away. It wasn't glamorous work, and it definitely wasn't well paid, but it kept the lights on, most of the time. Today was shaping up to be no different. I was hunched over a half-disassembled plasma relay that had absolutely no business still existing, let alone being repaired, trying to convince myself that it was salvageable. It wasn't, of course. The thing was a museum piece at best and a hazard at worst, but the client had insisted and I had bills to pay. So there I was, elbow deep in outdated wiring and bad decisions, when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just another engine passing by outside the bay. This station saw enough traffic that you learned to tune most of it out. But something about the sound made me pause. It wasn't the clean, regulated hum of modern drives, and it definitely wasn't the chaotic rattle of something on the verge of catastrophic failure. No, this was different, lower, rougher, almost mechanical in a way you didn't hear much anymore. It didn't glide so much as growl its way closer, uneven and stubborn, like it had no intention of stopping just because it probably should. I straightened slightly, frowning, and glanced toward the open bay just as the source of the noise came into view. The bike rolled in like it owned the place. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the damage, though there was plenty of that. Not the way one of the stabilizer fins was completely missing, or the deep scoring along the side panels, or the faint curl of smoke rising from a section that definitely shouldn't have been smoking. No. What stood out was the way it moved. Confident, controlled, like it wasn't barely holding together through sheer stubbornness, but choosing to look that way. Which in my experience usually meant one of two things. Either the owner had no idea how close they were to a catastrophic failure, or they knew exactly what they were doing. As the bike came to a slow stop in the middle of the bay, the engine gave a strained, uneven cycle that made my teeth itch. It tried to stabilize, failed, tried again, and then finally gave up entirely with a low, mechanical sigh. Silence settled in behind it, thick and sudden. I set my tools down a little more carefully than usual, wiping my hands on a rag that had long since stopped pretending to be clean, and made my way over. Up close, the damage was even worse. And yet, there were details that didn't match. Small things. Easy to miss if you didn't know what you were looking at. The kind of inconsistencies that made the whole machine feel wrong, somehow. Interesting. My attention shifted, almost reluctantly, from the bike to its rider. She hadn't moved much since stopping, but there was a stillness to her that felt deliberate rather than passive. Tall, composed, and watching, really watching. Everything around her with a level of focus you didn't usually see in people who wandered into places like this, including me. That, more than anything, told me this wasn't going to be a simple job. I stopped a few steps away, crossing my arms loosely as I gave the bike one last look over, more out of habit than anything else. "Well," I said at last, my voice cutting through the quiet in a way that felt almost too loud after the engine had died. "I can already tell this is going to be expensive." Her head tilted slightly at that, just enough to suggest curiosity rather than surprise. Then she smiled. It wasn't a nervous smile or an apologetic one. If anything, it looked amused. "Money," she said, her voice smooth and unhurried, "isn't an issue." I let out a short breath, something halfway between a laugh and a sigh, and shook my head as I glanced back at the bike. "Yeah," I muttered, reaching out to tap a scorched panel lightly with my knuckles. "That's what they all say." I paused for a moment, studying the damage a little more closely before adding, almost as an afterthought, "Right up until it is." I crouched down beside the bike, leaning in just enough to get a proper look at the exposed sections of the engine housing, letting my attention settle there rather than on her. Machines, at least, tended to be honest about what was wrong with them. People, less so. Up close, the damage was even more apparent, but so were the inconsistencies. The outer casing looked like it had been through a war. Scorched plating, uneven repairs, mismatched materials that had no business being bolted together. And yet beneath all of that, the structure held a kind of precision that didn't belong in a place like this. The framework was clean where it mattered, almost elegant in its design, and it didn't take long to realize that the rough exterior wasn't the result of neglect. It was deliberate. I brushed some of the carbon scoring aside with my thumb, studying the lines beneath it, and felt a faint frown settle in as I tried to place exactly what I was looking at. "That's not standard," I said more to the machine than to her, my voice quieter now that I was actually thinking. Behind me, her reply came without hesitation, smooth and unbothered. She remarked that most things worth having rarely were, and there was something in the way she said it that suggested she wasn't just talking about the bike. I let out a quiet breath that almost passed for a laugh, shifting slightly so I could get a better angle on what looked like a misaligned coupling buried just beneath the surface. "In my experience," I said, easing a tool into place as I worked, "most things worth having don't usually arrive looking like they've lost an argument with orbital debris." There was a brief pause, not the kind that came from offense, but the sort that felt more like she was deciding how to respond. She eventually explained, in that same calm tone, that the damage had been situational. I nodded faintly, though I didn't bother to look back at her just yet, my focus still on the resistance I was feeling through the tool. It wasn't what I expected. There was a smoothness to it, a responsiveness that didn't match the battered exterior. That alone told me more than enough. "Right," I murmured, adjusting my grip slightly. "So you pushed it too far, ignored the warnings, and trusted it to hold together anyway." She responded by reframing that idea as confidence in the machine's ability to rise to the occasion, which earned a quiet, almost involuntary huff of amusement from me. "That's one way of looking at it," I replied, carefully easing the component back into alignment. "Another would be that you ran it into the ground and expected it not to complain." That time, the reaction behind me was harder to miss. It wasn't loud, but there was a definite trace of laughter there, quickly softened, as if she hadn't entirely meant to let it slip. I filed that away without thinking too much about it, shifting my position so I could loosen one of the panels enough to see deeper into the engine's core systems. What I found there made me pause in a way the surface damage hadn't. The internal components were refined. There was no other word for it. The fabrication was precise, the layout efficient without being rigid, and the materials, what I could see of them, were far beyond anything that should have ended up in a repair bay on a station like this. And right in the middle of it all sat something almost anachronistic. A manual override assembly, properly mechanical, not simulated, not digitized, but physical in a way that most modern systems had long since abandoned. I felt a small, genuine smile form before I could stop it, the kind that came from recognizing something unexpectedly well made. "Well," I said, a little more engaged now as I studied it, "that's not something you see every day." She asked whether I had found the problem, and there was a subtle shift in her tone this time, an edge of curiosity that hadn't been there before. "I've found one of them," I replied, reaching in carefully to test the assembly's movement. "This override's been forced too many times. It's not seating properly anymore, which means the system keeps trying to compensate for something it can't quite correct. That's where your instability's coming from." There was a moment of quiet after that, just long enough to be noticeable. When she spoke again, she observed that I had come to that conclusion rather quickly. I shrugged lightly, though the motion was mostly lost from where I was crouched. "It's the sort of thing that stands out once you know what you're looking for," I said, which was only partly true. In reality, it should have taken longer, should have required diagnostics, scans, time. But the flaw had been almost obvious the moment I'd seen how the system was behaving. I adjusted the assembly with a bit more care, feeling the way it settled under the correction, and added, almost absently, that whoever had built the system had known exactly what they were doing. There was a balance to it, a deliberate choice in combining older mechanical control with more advanced components, and that wasn't something you threw together by accident. She asked then whether I didn't trust automated systems, and that time I did glance back at her, catching the way her attention had narrowed slightly. There was intent behind the question. Trust's got nothing to do with it, I said, straightening just enough to rest back on my heels. They're efficient, and when they work, they're great. But when something goes wrong, they don't adapt. They either lock up or start compensating in ways that make things worse. And then you're stuck waiting on parts you can't get or repairs you can't afford. I gestured lightly toward the exposed assembly. With something like this, at least the problem stays honest. You can feel it, see where it's gone wrong. It doesn't pretend everything's fine while quietly falling apart underneath. That seemed to hold her attention more than anything else I'd said so far. She remarked after a moment that most mechanics on the station would already have started recommending full replacements, likely at a considerable cost. I pushed myself back to my feet, wiping my hands again out of habit as I gave the bike one last assessing look. Most mechanics here would take one look at this and see an opportunity, I said. Replace half the system, charge you for all of it, and call it necessary whether it was or not. I nodded slightly toward the engine. You don't need that. Not yet. Fix the override, stabilize the feedback, clean up a few of the worst connections, and it'll run well enough. Not perfect, but you're not aiming for perfect, are you? Her gaze lingered on me for a moment longer than I expected before she asked, almost casually, what that would cost. There it was, the part where things usually became complicated. I leaned back against the edge of the workbench, folding my arms loosely as I considered it for a moment. The number itself wasn't difficult to settle on. It was the kind of repair I'd done often enough to know exactly what it was worth. But something about the way she was watching me made it feel like the answer mattered in a way it usually didn't. Not financially, personally. I gave her the figure anyway. It was fair. Lower than some would charge. Higher than I probably should have, given how things had been lately. But honest in a way that didn't leave much room for argument. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied me, her expression shifting just slightly as if she were recalibrating something. When she finally spoke, she noted that the price was lower than she had expected. I gave a small, indifferent shrug in response. It's what the job's worth, I said. For a brief moment, neither of us said anything. Then, slowly, a different kind of smile found its way onto her face. Not amused this time, and not guarded either, but something quieter, more genuine. I see, she said, and something in the way she said it made it clear that she understood more than just the number. For reasons I couldn't quite put into words, that realization left me with a faint sense that I'd just stepped into something more complicated than a simple repair job. I had expected that to be the end of it. The point where she would either agree to the price and disappear to pass the time elsewhere, or hesitate just long enough to suggest she might come back later once she had decided whether it was worth it. That was how it usually went. People didn't linger in places like this unless they had no other choice. And even then, they tended to do it reluctantly, as if the station itself might stain them if they stayed too long. Thalira, however, made no move to leave. If anything, she seemed to settle more comfortably into her stillness, her attention drifting across the workshop for a moment, taking in the cluttered benches, the worn tools, the layered evidence of years spent fixing other people's problems, before returning to me with that same quiet, deliberate focus she had held since the moment she arrived. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a measured certainty, as though she had already come to her conclusion well before I had given her the number. She said the price seemed reasonable, and then, without pause, asked how long the repairs would take. I glanced back toward the bike, letting my eyes trace over the exposed sections again as I ran through the work in my head, adjusting the estimate now that I had a clearer understanding of what I was dealing with. It wasn't complicated in the traditional sense, but there was a level of precision involved that meant rushing it would only create more problems later. After a moment, I told her it would take a few hours, adding that it might take longer if I found anything else that looked like it was about to fail. Her gaze shifted briefly toward the engine, following the line of my attention before returning to me, and she asked with quiet directness, what would happen if I did? I told her that I would either fix it or tell her it wasn't worth fixing, depending on what I found, and left it at that. That answer seemed to satisfy her, at least on the surface, as she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as though something had just been confirmed. Then, after a brief pause that felt more like a decision than hesitation, she stepped a little closer. It wasn't enough to crowd the space or interfere with what I was doing, but it was enough that I became more aware of her presence than I had been before, enough that the quiet of the workshop felt subtly different with her standing there. She said simply that she would wait. For a second, I thought I had misheard her. People didn't wait. Not here. Not for this kind of work, and certainly not without complaint. I glanced toward the entrance of the bay, half expecting her to follow that statement with something more practical. But when nothing came, I looked back at her instead. I told her she didn't have to do that there was nothing here worth watching, and that I would let her know when the work was done. She replied, just as calmly, that she was sure I would, but that she found she preferred to observe. There was a faint trace of amusement in her tone again, but it sat beneath something more genuine, something that made it difficult to dismiss her words as idle curiosity. I studied her for a moment, weighing whether this was going to complicate things in ways I didn't need, but there was nothing in her posture to suggest she would interfere, and the way she held herself, still attentive but not intrusive, made it clear that if she said she would simply watch, then that was exactly what she intended to do. Even so, I felt the need to point out that the workshop wasn't exactly a comfortable place to spend a few hours, and that I didn't tend to make my work particularly entertaining. She answered without hesitation, telling me that it wasn't the entertainment that interested her. Something about the way she said it made me pause, just briefly, before I let out a quiet breath and gave a small, resigned nod. I told her it was her choice, turning back toward the bike, as I added that she should try not to touch anything important, since some of it had a habit of reacting badly to the wrong kind of attention. Her reply came softer that time, but no less certain, as she said she would keep that in mind. With that, I returned to the work. I eased the panel I had loosened fully free, setting it aside with a bit more care than I usually would, and as I reached for the next tool, I became aware, without really meaning to, that her attention hadn't wavered. It wasn't distracting exactly, but it was noticeable. Most people didn't watch like that. They either hovered too close, asking questions every few seconds, or lost interest the moment things stopped being immediately understandable, drifting off into their own thoughts while they waited. Talira did neither. She watched with a kind of quiet focus that suggested she was taking in more than just the surface of what I was doing, following the movement of my hands, the adjustments I made without thinking, the small decisions that didn't look like much unless you already knew what they meant. For a while, the only sounds in the bay were the muted clink of tools against metal, the faint, distant hum of traffic moving through the station beyond the walls, and the occasional shift of components as I worked through the worst of the damage. It was the kind of silence I was used to, the kind that usually settled in when there was nothing left to say. This time, it didn't last. After a while, she asked where I had learned to do this, her voice breaking into the quiet without disrupting it, as though she had been considering the question for some time before deciding to ask it. I didn't look up straight away, focusing instead on easing a stubborn connector free before answering, telling her that I had picked up most of it here, though I had learned the basics back on Earth before I ever came out this far. I added, almost absently, that out here, you either learned quickly or you didn't last very long. There was a brief pause after that, and when she spoke again, there was something different in her tone, something more thoughtful, more deliberate. She observed that I had lasted. I gave a small shrug, finally glancing back at her. I told her that depended on how you defined lasting, that I was still here, and that counted for something, even if it wasn't exactly a success story. Her gaze held mine for a moment longer than necessary, as though she were weighing that answer against something else, before she said that someone with my skill could work elsewhere, that there would be better opportunities available if I chose to take them. I let out a quiet breath at that, something almost like a laugh, though without much humor behind it, and turned my attention back to the engine as I admitted that she was probably right. I didn't elaborate, and for once, she didn't immediately follow up. Instead, she returned to watching, not casually, not idly, but with that same steady focus, as though the act of observing itself mattered. After a few minutes of that, I found myself speaking again, more out of curiosity than anything else, asking whether she was always this interested in repair work. There was the faintest hint of a smile in her voice when she answered, admitting that she usually wasn't, but that this, whatever this was, felt different. I paused just long enough to glance back at her again, asking what she meant by that. She considered the question for a moment, her gaze shifting briefly toward the bike before returning to me, and then said, slowly and with a kind of quiet certainty, that most people she met were far more interested in what something was worth than in how it worked. I let that sit for a second before nodding once in agreement, telling her that, in my experience, that sounded about right. But there was something in the way she continued to watch me after that, quieter now, but somehow more certain, that made it clear the conversation had shifted, that it wasn't really about the bike anymore. And, somewhat unexpectedly, I found that I didn't mind that nearly as much as I probably should have. I turned my attention back to the engine after that, letting the conversation settle into something quieter as I worked through the next stage of the repair, though I was more aware of her presence now than I had been when she first arrived. It wasn't just that she was still watching. It was the way she watched, patient, attentive, and entirely unbothered by the passage of time in a place where most people would have grown restless within minutes. There was no fidgeting, no distraction, no sign that she was simply waiting for the work to be done so she could leave. If anything, it felt as though this standing here, observing, asking the occasional question, was exactly where she wanted to be. That alone was unusual enough to hold my attention more than I would have liked to admit. I adjusted the override assembly again, applying a careful amount of pressure until I felt it settle properly into place. And as I did, I became aware of her shifting slightly closer, not enough to interfere, but enough that I could sense the movement without needing to look. "You approach it differently," she said after a while, her voice quieter now, as though she had no interest in disturbing the rhythm of the work. "Most would have relied on diagnostic systems before attempting a manual correction." I let out a faint breath through my nose, something that might have passed for amusement if there had been more energy behind it. "Most people trust the systems they're given," I said, easing my hand back and reaching for another tool without rushing. "I've spent enough time fixing their mistakes to know better." There was a slight pause behind me, and when she spoke again, there was something thoughtful in her tone. Something that suggested she was turning that answer over rather than simply responding to it. "And yet," she said, "you choose to remain here, working with this." There was no insult in the way she said it, no dismissal of the station or the workshop, but the contrast was there all the same, subtle and unspoken. I glanced back at her briefly before returning to the engine. "It's what I've got," I replied, "and it works." She didn't answer immediately, and for a moment I thought she might leave it there, but then she stepped just slightly closer again, her gaze drifting past me to the exposed components I was working on. "It works," she repeated, as though testing the words. "But it is not where you belong." That made me pause just for a second before I continued working. I had heard variations of that before, usually from people who had no real understanding of what it meant to end up somewhere like this, and I almost dismissed it out of habit. Almost. "What makes you so sure about that?" I asked, not looking up this time. There was a faint shift in the air behind me, the kind that came when someone realized they had said more than they intended to. For the first time since she had arrived, Thalira didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was just as calm as before, but there was a subtle adjustment to it now, something more measured. "Because," she said slowly, "I have seen what individuals with your capabilities are typically offered, and this is considerably below that threshold." I stilled for a fraction of a second, the tool in my hand hovering just above the component I'd been about to adjust. That wasn't a normal way of phrasing things, not for someone who had introduced herself as nothing more than a traveler with a damaged bike. I finished the adjustment before responding, more out of habit than anything else, and then leaned back slightly, resting my hands against the edge of the frame as I considered that. Typically offered, I repeated, glancing back at her properly now. That sounds like you've spent a fair bit of time looking at contracts. There it was, a small shift. Subtle, but impossible to miss once you were paying attention. For the briefest moment, her expression changed. Not dramatically, not enough that most people would have caught it, but just enough to suggest that she hadn't expected me to pick up on that. Then it was gone, replaced once more by that same composed calm she wore so easily. I have some familiarity with such matters, she said. I held her gaze for a second longer than I normally would have, letting the silence stretch just enough to make the point that I didn't quite believe that answer. Then, eventually, I let it go. Right, I said, turning back to the bike. Well, whoever you've been talking to, they're probably offering people a lot more than I'm worth. That is unlikely. The response came immediately this time, without hesitation, and with just enough certainty behind it to make me pause again. I let out a quiet breath, shaking my head slightly as I reached back into the engine. Yeah, I muttered. I've heard that one before as well. This time, when she didn't respond, the silence felt different. Not empty. Focused. I could feel her attention settle on me more intently than before, as though something about that exchange had shifted the way she was looking at me, even if I couldn't see it directly. After a few moments, I spoke again, more to break that feeling than anything else. So, I said, adjusting another connection as I worked, what exactly do you usually do when you're not testing the patience of underpaid mechanics? There was a brief pause behind me, followed by the faintest trace of amusement returning to her voice. I was not aware that I was testing your patience. I allowed myself a small, dry smile at that. You're still here, I said. That's usually how it starts. That earned a soft sound from her, closer to a laugh this time, though still controlled, still measured in a way that suggested she was more used to holding that kind of reaction back than letting it show. I will endeavor to be less intrusive, she said. You're not intrusive, I replied, before I had quite decided whether I was going to say it. That made me pause more than anything she'd said so far. I frowned slightly, more at myself than at her, before continuing with the repair as if I hadn't just admitted something I hadn't fully thought through. It's just unusual, I added after a moment, as though that explained it. There was a quiet beat of silence behind me, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened, just slightly. In what way? I considered that for a second, then shrugged faintly. Most people don't stick around unless they want something, I said, or unless they're waiting for a chance to argue about the price. And I am doing neither, she observed. Yeah, I said, glancing back at her again. You're not. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then slowly, that same faint, genuine smile returned to her expression, and this time there was something warmer in it, something that hadn't been there before. No, she said quietly. I am not. And the way she said it made it clear that whatever she was doing here, it had very little to do with the bike. I had just about settled back into the rhythm of the work when I became aware of something shifting at the edge of the workshop entrance. Not a sound at first, not even movement that immediately registered as important, but rather the subtle change in atmosphere that came when someone entered a space who didn't belong to it. The kind of presence that made the air feel slightly more structured, more deliberate, as though the station itself had briefly decided to pay attention. Footsteps followed a moment later, heavier than mine, more confident in the way that usually came from people who were used to being listened to before they even spoke. I didn't look up straight away. Mechanics learned early that most interruptions were either complaints, questions, or people trying to convince you that whatever you were doing should be done faster and cheaper than physics would reasonably allow. But the Lyra shifted slightly, not away from me, but subtly into a position that placed her just a fraction more out of direct sight from the entrance. A movement so small it would have been easy to miss if I hadn't already been paying more attention to her than I intended to. That alone made me pause. Then I heard the voice, It wasn't loud, but it carried a kind of practiced authority, the sort that didn't need volume to fill a space. "Didn't expect to see you down here." I finally looked up. There were two of them standing near the entrance to the bay, both dressed in station-issue maintenance uniforms that were too clean to suggest they spent much time actually working in environments like this. The first was a broad-shouldered man with a clipped posture and the kind of expression that suggested he considered every situation a potential administrative problem. The second lingered slightly behind him, younger, observant, eyes already scanning the workshop with open curiosity. But neither of them were looking at me. Their attention was fixed almost entirely on Thalira. And that was when I saw her properly. Not as the damaged bike's owner, not as the quiet presence who had been watching me work, but as something that didn't quite belong in the same category as the people around her. She was tall, noticeably so, even without trying to emphasize it, standing with a stillness that made her seem even more composed than before. But it wasn't just her posture that drew the eye. Her skin had a faint, almost imperceptible shift in tone, depending on how the light hit it, as though it couldn't quite decide whether it wanted to reflect or absorb what surrounded it. There were subtle markings along the side of her neck and collarbone, natural, not decorative, that suggested biology rather than fashion, and when she turned her head slightly, I noticed the way her eyes caught the workshop lighting in a way that wasn't entirely human, a deeper, layered reflection that suggested something more complex behind them than simple color and iris. She looked, in a word, expensive. Not in the sense of clothing or accessories, though whatever she was wearing was clearly far above anything a dockside mechanic should ever reasonably encounter, but in the way certain things simply felt out of place in environments like this, as though the station itself hadn't been designed with her presence in mind. The taller of the two station workers stepped forward slightly, and when he spoke again, there was a noticeable shift in tone, something tighter around the edges. "I wasn't told you'd be docking here under informal clearance." Thalira didn't react immediately. When she did, it was with the same calm composure she had shown me, though something in her posture had subtly changed, becoming a fraction more closed, more contained. "I am not here on official capacity," she said evenly. That answer didn't seem to satisfy him. His gaze flicked briefly toward the bike, then back to her, as though reassessing the situation in real time. "You're aware this station has protocols regarding independent arrivals of your classification," he said carefully, like he was choosing each word to avoid stepping on something he couldn't see. "I am aware," she replied. The simplicity of it didn't help him. Behind him, the younger worker shifted slightly, glancing between her and me as though trying to piece together how I fit into any of this, and I could practically feel the questions forming before they were spoken. That was when Thalira's eyes briefly met mine again. Just for a second. Not pleading, not worried, but something quieter than that, something that suggested she preferred this conversation not become what it was about to become. And for the first time since she had walked into my bay, I realized I had absolutely no idea who she actually was. The silence that followed her last glance at me lingered just long enough to feel deliberate, as though the entire workshop had been quietly waiting for someone to decide what the next version of this conversation was going to be. The station official shifted his attention away from her and finally looked at me properly, as if only now registering that I wasn't just part of the background machinery. "You are the technician assigned to this bay," he said, though it wasn't really a question. I straightened slightly, resting one hand against the edge of the bike's exposed frame, more out of habit than respect, and gave a small nod. "That's right," I replied. "Jack Rourke. I'm assigned here until something breaks badly enough to justify moving me somewhere else." The younger worker gave a faint, almost involuntary snort at that, quickly trying to hide it when the senior officer shot him a glance. The officer ignored it. His attention shifted back toward Thalira again, his expression tightening in a way that suggested this wasn't a social visit, nor something he particularly wanted to deal with personally. "This individual arrived under irregular clearance," he said, gesturing slightly in her direction. "There are procedures regarding unscheduled arrivals of off-world assets that must be—" "She's not an asset," I cut in, before I had fully decided to do so. The words came out more evenly than I expected, but they landed cleanly in the space between them, enough to interrupt the rhythm of authority that had been building in the room. The officer looked at me again, properly this time, as though recalibrating what category I belonged to. "I beg your pardon," he said. I let out a quiet breath through my nose and straightened a little more, wiping my hands on a rag that had seen better decades. "I said she's not an asset," I repeated. "She's a customer. Her bike came in for repair. I'm repairing it. That's the extent of my involvement in whatever this is turning into." Behind him, the younger worker glanced at the bike again, then at Thalira, then at me, looking increasingly like he had walked into a conversation he hadn't been given the briefing notes for. The officer's jaw tightened slightly. "That designation is not for you to determine," he said. "Probably not," I agreed, nodding once as if that was a reasonable point. "But unless I've suddenly been promoted to someone who gets to argue with paperwork instead of fixing engines, I'm going to keep treating her like a customer until someone gives me a very good reason not to." That landed differently, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to change the temperature of the room. The officer didn't respond immediately, and in that pause I became aware of Thalira again, not looking at the official anymore, but at me instead. There was something in her expression now that hadn't been there before, something quieter and more focused, as though she was watching a version of me she hadn't expected to exist. Not just the mechanic, not just the man fixing her bike. Something else, forming in real time. The officer exhaled slowly through his nose, clearly deciding that this conversation was slipping away from procedural control. "You are aware," he said at last, more measured now, "that this individual's arrival was flagged at a classification level that exceeds your clearance." I shrugged slightly. "I'm aware that most things here are flagged at a level that exceeds my clearance," I replied. "That's usually why they end up in my workshop instead of someone else's." That earned another brief silence, this one heavier. The officer looked at me for a long moment, then back at Thalira, and something in his expression suggested that he was now reconsidering whether I was ignorant, stubborn, or simply not worth the effort of displacing. Before he could respond again, Thalira finally spoke. Her voice was calm, but there was a subtle shift in it now, something firmer beneath the surface. "It is unnecessary," she said. Both men turned toward her. She didn't look at them immediately, though. Her attention remained on me for a fraction of a second longer than it needed to, as though anchoring herself to the situation I had just created. Then she addressed the officer directly. "I will comply with station procedure if required," she continued evenly. "However, I would prefer this matter not interfere with the current repair." The officer hesitated. That hesitation alone told me more than anything else had so far. Whatever she was, whatever classification or clearance or bureaucratic category she belonged to, she wasn't someone he was used to pushing around. Finally, he gave a short nod. "Ensure it is resolved within protocol," he said, though it sounded more like a concession than an order. Then he turned slightly, already preparing to leave. The younger worker followed, but not before casting one last, lingering look back into the bay, his gaze briefly landing on Thalira with open curiosity, before snapping away when the officer moved. Their footsteps faded toward the corridor, leaving the workshop noticeably quieter than it had been moments before. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Just the hum of the station, the faint ticking of cooling metal, and the distant echo of something far larger than this small, enclosed space. Then I finally broke the silence without looking up from the bike. "Well," I said, "that's probably going to get worse before it gets better." A pause. Then behind me, Thalira gave the faintest sound, something almost like agreement, but softer. "Yes," she said quietly. And then after a moment that lingered just a little longer than it should have, "Thank you, Jack Rourke." It was the first time she had used my name, and somehow it felt like the first time anything in this workshop had actually mattered. The workshop didn't return to normal after they left. It tried to, in the way places do when authority leaves a room and everyone pretends the air hasn't changed, but something about the space still felt slightly altered, as though the conversation had left faint pressure marks on it that hadn't quite faded yet. I let the silence settle for a few seconds, longer than necessary, more out of instinct than thought, before finally reaching back into the exposed frame of the bike and resuming the repair. The next connection needed careful alignment, and I found that my hands were steadier than my thoughts. Behind me, Thalira moved again, not approaching this time, but shifting her stance as though she had also decided the interruption was over, and that whatever fragile structure had formed before it was still intact enough to return to. She watched me work for a moment without speaking. Then, quietly, she said my name again. Jack Rourke. This time it wasn't an introduction or a confirmation. It sounded more like she was testing the way it sat in the air between us, as though it had weight she hadn't expected. I paused just long enough to acknowledge it. "That's me," I replied simply. There was a brief silence, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a slightly different cadence, less guarded than before, though still carefully controlled. "You did not need to speak to him like that," she said. I let out a small breath through my nose, focusing on reseating a connector before answering. "Probably not," I admitted. "But he was talking about you like you weren't standing right there. I don't like that." That seemed to register with her more than I intended. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it had a different texture to it now, less observational and more reflective, as though she was turning the idea over in her mind without immediately deciding what to do with it. After a moment, she stepped a little closer to the bike again, close enough now that I could hear the subtle shift of her movement, rather than just sense it. "You continue to assume a great deal," she said. "I work in maintenance," I replied without looking up. "Assumption is basically part of the job description. If I waited for perfect information, nothing would ever get fixed." That earned something faint from her again. Not quite a laugh, but something softer than her usual composure allowed. "And yet," she said, "you chose to act without knowing who I am." That made me pause for a fraction longer, not because I didn't have an answer, but because I did, and it was one of those answers that felt too simple to be entirely safe to say out loud. "I didn't choose anything," I said eventually, continuing the work as I spoke. "You were standing here and someone was treating you like you didn't have a say in what happens next. That's usually enough for me." There was another silence, but this one felt different again, closer. When she spoke next, her voice was quieter. "Most people wait for certainty before they decide how to treat me," she said. I glanced back at her briefly then, just long enough to catch her expression before returning to the engine. "Most people don't work in places where waiting for certainty gets you killed," I replied. That drew another small pause from her, longer this time. Then she stepped closer again, stopping just beside the bike where she could see what I was doing more clearly, her presence now firmly within my space rather than at the edge of it. "I should correct something," she said after a moment. I raised an eyebrow slightly, still not looking at her. "Go on." There was a brief hesitation, just enough to suggest that whatever she was about to say mattered more than anything she had said so far. "My name," she said quietly, "is Talira Vale." That made me stop, not dramatically, not immediately, just long enough for my hand to still against the frame. I finally looked up at her properly then. Talira Vale. It didn't mean anything to me in the way I suspected it meant something to the rest of the station, but the way she said it, the way she waited after saying it, suggested it was supposed to. I repeated it once, slowly, as though testing it the same way she had tested mine. "Talira Vale," I said. A faint shift passed across her expression again, not relief exactly, but something close to acknowledgement, as though hearing it spoken back mattered in a way she hadn't fully expected. "Yes," she said quietly, "that is who I am." I nodded once, as if that settled something. "All right," I said, turning back to the bike and continuing the repair as though nothing fundamental had just changed. "Good to know." There was a pause behind me. Then, after a moment, her voice softened slightly. "And you're not going to ask what that means?" I let out a faint, almost tired sound that might have been a laugh if I'd had more sleep in the last cycle. "I fix engines," I said. "If I start fixing identities as well, I'm going to need a raise I don't think this station is capable of approving." That did it. This time she did laugh, quietly, briefly, but unmistakably real. And when she did, something in the workshop felt less like a chance encounter, and more like the beginning of something neither of us had fully agreed to yet. Her laughter hadn't quite faded from the space when the workshop fell into its rhythm again, but it left something behind that didn't quite fit with the usual hum of machinery and cooling metal. I turned back into the repair properly this time, hands moving more automatically than before, because the work was familiar enough that I didn't need to think about it as much as I needed to stay aware of everything else in the room. Talira Vale. The name sat somewhere at the edge of my attention, not because I recognized it, but because I didn't, and the way she had said it made it clear that, somewhere out there, other people absolutely would. She remained close now, not hovering at a distance like before the interruption, but positioned just beside the bike where she could see the exposed systems clearly, as though she had decided that watching was no longer enough. For a while she didn't speak. Neither did I. It should have felt comfortable, that silence. But there was a subtle tension to it now that came from the awareness that things had shifted without either of us explicitly agreeing to let them shift. Then, without warning, a faint chime echoed through the workshop. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even particularly sharp, but it came from my terminal. I frowned slightly, wiping my hands again before stepping over to the console mounted along the side of the bay. The display had lit up with a standard station notification, the kind I usually ignored unless it was flagged directly to my assignment queue. This one wasn't. It was routed through administrative channels above my clearance level. The terminal didn't just chime this time. It seemed to settle into a rhythm of its own, as though the station itself had quietly decided that whatever was happening in my workshop was now important enough to be monitored in real time. And that thought alone made the entire space feel subtly smaller than it had a few minutes ago. I kept my eyes on the screen for a moment longer than necessary, reading and rereading the same lines as though they might rearrange themselves into something less problematic if I gave them enough attention. But the wording remained stubbornly consistent, precise in the way only automated systems could manage when they were following a chain of authority that had already been set in motion. Unscheduled entity identification request received. Vale, Thalira. Confirmed cross-reference in progress. There was something about seeing it displayed so clinically that made it feel more real than anything spoken aloud ever could, because words carried in a room could be argued with, questioned, or ignored. But a station-wide administrative network did not concern itself with interpretation or conversation. Behind me, I could feel Thalira shift her attention toward the terminal without needing to turn around, not in panic or surprise, but in the quiet, contained way of someone who had always understood that names were never just names, especially not when they were attached to systems large enough to recognize them without hesitation. Another notification followed shortly after, this one more direct, more structured, and less interested in ambiguity than the last. Priority shift, station security advised, unregistered high classification individual located in maintenance sector 7. I let out a slow breath through my nose, leaning slightly against the edge of the console as I processed exactly how quickly a quiet afternoon repair had turned into something that now had procedural language attached to it, because nothing ever escalated quite so efficiently as systems that believed they were being helpful. Yeah, I muttered under my breath, more to the machine than to her, though I was aware she could hear it perfectly well. That's not great. There was a pause behind me, and when Thalira spoke, her voice carried the same calm control it always had, though now it felt a fraction more deliberate, as if she was choosing each word with greater care than before. You are receiving alerts. I nodded once without turning fully, still looking at the screen, as if there might be some alternative interpretation hiding in the margins that I had somehow missed the first time. Yeah, I replied quietly. I am. Another pause followed, longer this time, and when I finally turned to look at her properly, I noticed that her posture had changed in ways that were subtle enough to miss if you weren't already paying attention, but unmistakable once you were, because composure and tension often looked identical from a distance, and only revealed their difference when the situation started to tighten around them. Your name just lit up half the station's administrative network, I added, mostly because pretending otherwise seemed pointless at this stage. A faint reaction crossed her expression at that, not dramatic, not emotional in the way humans tended to assume emotions should present themselves, but something quieter and more internal, as though she was recalculating the shape of the situation in real time and not entirely satisfied with the result. Unfortunate, she said softly. I gave a small exhale that might have been a laugh if it had carried more energy behind it, then glanced briefly back at the terminal as yet another update began to scroll through. That depends entirely on what you were trying to do when you came here, I replied. Her gaze met mine for a moment, steady and unblinking, and I had the distinct impression that this was one of those questions she could answer in multiple ways, depending on how much truth she was willing to expose at once. "I was not attempting to be noticed," she said at last. "Yeah," I murmured, turning back toward the console as the system continued to insist on escalating itself. That part of the plan seems to have gone a bit sideways. The next alert came through with noticeably less hesitation than the others, as though whatever threshold had been crossed had finally been acknowledged by something more direct than administrative procedure. "Security team deployed. Maintenance Sector 7. Maintain visual on target veil. Thalira." The silence that followed that message wasn't empty, not in the way silence usually was, but dense in a way that made it feel like it had weight, as though the air itself had become aware that it was now part of an unfolding decision rather than just a neutral space between conversations. I shut the terminal off. Not because it changed anything, but because I didn't need it reinforcing what was already obvious. When I turned back toward her again, she was still standing beside the bike, still composed in that carefully maintained way that suggested discipline rather than ease. But now there was something beneath it that hadn't been there before, something quieter and more contained that hinted at the fact that she was no longer simply observing the situation so much as preparing for it. I let the silence sit for a moment longer, then spoke without raising my voice, keeping it steady, almost conversational despite everything tightening around us. "All right," I said. "Before this gets loud and complicated, do you want to tell me what I've actually walked into here?" And for the first time since she had stepped into my workshop, Thalira Vale didn't answer immediately, and that hesitation, small as it was enough to make the entire room feel like it was waiting with her. Thalira didn't answer immediately, and in that silence there was something different from the ones that had come before it, something less like hesitation and more like calculation, as though she had begun to draw a line between what could be safely said and what could no longer afford to remain unspoken. When she finally spoke, her voice was still steady, but it had lost a fraction of its earlier ease, as though she was now speaking from a slightly more guarded place within herself. "My arrival here was not meant to be recorded through official channels," she said quietly, her gaze briefly shifting toward the closed terminal, as if she could still see the alerts I had dismissed moments earlier. "And certainly not meant to trigger a security classification response." I leaned lightly against the edge of the bike's frame, not interrupting, not because I was being polite, but because something in her tone suggested that if I broke the rhythm of what she was about to say, she might not continue at all. She exhaled slowly, then continued. "I am not supposed to be within this sector of the system without authorization," she said, choosing the phrasing carefully, as though every word had to pass through layers of internal agreement before being allowed to leave her. "There are structures in place that would interpret my presence here as either an error or a breach." I gave a faint nod, more to acknowledge that I was following than because I fully understood where it was heading. "And which one is it?" I asked quietly. For the first time, she looked at me directly rather than through the situation, as though grounding herself in something that wasn't part of the wider station network. "Neither," she said. "It is intentional." That landed in the space between us more heavily than anything else she had said so far. She turned slightly toward the bike then, as if needing the familiarity of it to continue speaking, her fingers hovering near one of the exposed panels without quite touching it, careful in the way someone was when they were aware that even small movements could ripple outward in ways they could no longer fully control. "I was born into a designation that carries obligations far beyond personal preference," she continued, her voice softening just slightly, as though she disliked the sound of her own explanation. "And most of what I am allowed to do, where I am allowed to go, and who I am permitted to interact with, is determined by systems that are not designed to consider individual variants." I let out a small breath through my nose, not quite a laugh, but close enough to acknowledge the absurdity of it. "Sounds like a very expensive kind of prison," I said. A faint flicker passed across her expression at that, something like reluctant agreement. "It is not described in those terms," she replied. "Yeah," I said quietly. "They rarely are." She looked at me again then, more directly this time, as though deciding whether or not I was the kind of person who needed the rest of the truth, or whether partial understanding would be safer for both of us. Before she could continue, the workshop lights flickered once, not dramatically, not enough to suggest failure, just a single interruption in the steady artificial rhythm of the station. I straightened slightly without thinking, my hand instinctively shifting closer to the nearest tool out of habit more than expectation. Thalira noticed it immediately. "They have initiated local scanning protocols," she said, her voice tightening just slightly at the edges. "Already?" I muttered, glancing toward the sealed entrance of the bay. A second flicker hit the lights, longer this time, and somewhere deeper in the station structure, I could hear the faint shift of systems rerouting themselves, like something large beginning to turn its attention toward a very specific point in space. Thalira stepped back from the bike for the first time since she had approached it, not in retreat exactly, but in recognition that the situation had crossed into a different phase than the one she had been trying to maintain. "I cannot remain here much longer without escalating exposure," she said quietly. I looked at her for a moment, then at the bike, then back toward the entrance as distant mechanical activity began to echo faintly through the corridor outside. "All right," I said, more to myself than to her at first, as something in my mind clicked into place. "So this is the part where things stop being conversations." She met my gaze again, and this time there was no attempt to soften what she was about to say next. "Yes," she said. "They are already transitioning to containment response," as if the station had been waiting for her to confirm it. A sharp metallic clang echoed somewhere outside the bay doors, then another, closer. I pushed off the bike fully now, my attention narrowing as the workshop shifted from problematic situation into something much more immediate. "Well," I said quietly, exhaling once as I reached for the tool rack without looking away from the entrance. "I suppose we're past the point where I pretend this is just a normal repair day." Thalira's eyes remained on me for a fraction longer than necessary. "No," she said softly, "we are not." And then the bay doors began to unlock. The sound of the bay doors unlocking didn't arrive all at once. It came in stages, like the station itself was carefully reconsidering whether it truly wanted to open them, with the first subtle shift of mechanical locks disengaging, followed by a deeper internal groan of metal that had been held under tension for far longer than it was designed to be. And finally, the faint hiss of pressure equalization that confirmed, without any room for interpretation, that whatever had been outside was now being granted permission to come in. I didn't move immediately. Not because I was calm, but because movement without purpose in situations like this tended to waste the only advantage you still had. Thalira, however, had already shifted again, her attention no longer split between conversation and explanation, but fully anchored in the present moment, as though whatever she had been about to say had either already been understood or had become secondary to what was about to happen next. "They are not coming to detain me alone," she said quietly. I glanced at her briefly. "That sounds like an important distinction," I replied. "It is," she said. Another metallic sound echoed down the corridor outside, closer now, more deliberate, followed by the unmistakable rhythm of the coordinated movement that suggested this was no longer an inspection or a misunderstanding that could be clarified with words. This was structured response. She stepped back toward the bike again, and this time when her hand moved near the exposed systems, she didn't hesitate before making contact, her fingers settling against a panel I hadn't fully resealed yet, as though she already knew exactly what she was looking for within it. "I cannot override station security protocols directly," she continued, her voice quieter now but sharper in focus. "But I can access partial system harmonics if the machine is still responsive to manual integration." I raised an eyebrow slightly. "That sounds like a very polite way of saying you're about to try something I probably should have been warned about earlier," I said. A faint flicker of something like frustration passed across her expression, though it was directed more at circumstance than at me. "I was not expecting escalation," she replied. "Yeah," I said, glancing toward the corridor again as the footsteps outside became clearer, heavier now, joined by the faint electronic hum of scanning equipment being brought online. "That seems to be happening a lot today." Another pause. Then she looked at me properly again, and when she spoke this time, her tone shifted just slightly, not louder, not more urgent, but more direct, as though she had finally decided that the remaining distance between what she was and what she was willing to reveal had become too small to maintain. "Jack," she said. Hearing my name like that again made something tighten slightly in my chest, though I couldn't have explained why if I'd tried. "I need you to understand something," she continued, her hand still resting against the bike as though maintaining contact with it was now part of whatever she was doing. "What you are currently calling a repair is not merely mechanical restoration. It is a partial resynchronization with a system architecture that is not native to your infrastructure." I stared at her for a moment, then at the bike, then back at her. "You're telling me," I said slowly, "that this thing is not just broken, it's also foreign in a way that interacts with your entire situation." "Yes," she said simply. I let out a quiet breath through my nose, the kind that carried equal parts disbelief and reluctant acceptance. Because at a certain point in life, you stop being surprised by how often just a simple job turns into something fundamentally more complicated than anyone involved originally agreed to. "Of course it is," I muttered. The bay doors shuddered again, closer now, much closer. Thalira's expression remained focused, but there was a subtle shift in her posture that suggested she was committing to a decision she could no longer delay. "If I initiate the harmonization sequence," she said, "the system will register a temporary identity convergence through the bike's remaining diagnostic framework. It will not stop them from entering, but it will delay recognition long enough for us to move." I frowned slightly. "Us," I repeated. Her gaze held mine for a brief moment. "Yes," she said. "You are already linked to this system through manual intervention. Exiting alone would not fully break the trace." That landed more heavily than I expected. Not because of danger, but because it made this suddenly feel less like her problem bleeding into my workspace, and more like something we were now structurally entangled in. Outside, the first impact hit the bay doors, a heavy, controlled strike, followed by a second. The lock systems held, but only just. I looked at the bike again, taking in the exposed systems, the half-completed work, the alien compatibility layers I hadn't fully understood when I started, and then I looked back at her. "You're asking me to finish a job I don't fully understand," I said. "I am asking you," she corrected quietly, "to trust that you already understand enough." Another impact hit the doors, harder this time, enough that dust shifted faintly from the overhead structures. I exhaled once, slow and controlled, then turned fully back to the bike. "All right," I said. "Tell me what to do." For the first time since she arrived, Thalira's composure softened just slightly, not breaking, not changing, but settling into something more aligned with mine. And outside, the bay doors began to buckle. The next impact against the bay doors didn't sound like an attempt anymore. It sounded like a decision being enforced. The metal groaned under it, not breaking yet, but no longer pretending it was comfortable holding its shape. And somewhere deeper in the station's structure, I could hear secondary systems rerouting power in a way that suggested this wasn't just a local security matter anymore, but something that was beginning to propagate outward through the station's own nervous system. Thalira didn't react to the sound in the way most people would have. There was no flinch, no glance toward the doors, no visible acknowledgement of the fact that the barrier between us and whatever was outside was now measured in seconds rather than minutes. Instead, she closed her eyes briefly, not in retreat, but in focus, and her hand settled more firmly against the exposed interface of the bike as though she was no longer treating it as a machine, so much as a point of contact between two systems that had never been meant to speak to one another. "I am initiating partial harmonization," she said quietly. The words didn't feel like instructions. They felt like alignment. The bike responded before I did, not with motion, but with a faint, almost imperceptible shift in its internal diagnostics, a subtle reordering of idle systems that I had not programmed and did not recognize, as though something inside it had been waiting for exactly this kind of input, and was now remembering how to respond. The workshop lights flickered again, but this time it wasn't random, it was synchronized. I straightened slightly without meaning to, my attention narrowing as the readouts on the half-active terminal beside me briefly flashed through diagnostic layers that were definitely not part of any standard station architecture, patterns and structures scrolling too quickly to fully parse, but repeating in ways that suggested intent rather than error. What did you just do? I asked quietly. Thalira didn't open her eyes. I am allowing the system to recognize continuity rather than intrusion, she said. That doesn't sound like something station security is going to appreciate, I replied. A faint pause. It is not designed to, she admitted. Another impact hit the doors, and this time the sound changed, becoming sharper at the edges, as though something had begun actively reinforcing the breach from the outside while simultaneously trying to force it open. The bike beneath her hand gave a low, steady pulse of energy in response. Not loud, not violent. Controlled, too controlled. And that was when I realized the thing I had been treating as a damaged machine wasn't just reacting to her presence. It was recognizing it. The diagnostic feed on my console flickered again, and for a fraction of a second, a new classification line appeared beneath the unreadable data stream. Origin layer, Veil Authority Node, confirmed partial access. I blinked at it, then looked back at her. Thalira, I said slowly, keeping my voice steady, even though something in my understanding of the situation had just shifted in a way I couldn't immediately recover from. What exactly are you connected to? She finally opened her eyes, and when she looked at me this time, there was no attempt to soften the answer. I am not merely connected, she said quietly. I am a registered convergence point within the governance architecture that oversees transit authorization across multiple aligned systems. I stared at her, once, then at the bike, then back again. You're part of the infrastructure, I said carefully, because my brain was still refusing to fully accept the phrasing it had just generated. I am an interface, she corrected, as if that made it simpler. A controlled presence within systems that require continuity oversight. Another impact hit the doors, and this time the left side locking mechanism finally gave a warning shriek that suggested it had reached the limit of its willingness to participate. I let out a slow breath. So, I said, you didn't crash here because you were lost. No, she said, you didn't arrive here because of an accident. No. I nodded once, more to myself than anything else. You're here because you chose a system-level blind spot, I said quietly. A pause, then she gave the smallest possible inclination of her head. Yes, that should have felt like betrayal, or at least deception. But instead, what I felt was something stranger, because she hadn't lied. She had simply never offered the scale of the truth. The bike pulsed again under her hand, stronger this time, and the diagnostics on my console shifted in response, stabilizing into something I now recognized as a handshake protocol, except not one designed for human systems, not even close, but something older, more layered, and disturbingly familiar in the way it seemed to assume compliance rather than request it. Outside, the bay doors finally buckled inward with a deep, resonant crash, not fully open, but no longer sealed. And through the widening gap, I could hear the next wave of movement arriving behind the first. Thalira didn't look toward it. Instead, she spoke more softly, almost to herself now, as though confirming a decision she had already made before she ever stepped into this workshop. The harmonization window is open, she said. We will not have long. I exhaled once, then moved back toward the bike, placing my hand where hers wasn't, feeling the faint, controlled pulse of whatever she had awakened, moving through systems that were never supposed to carry it. All right, I said quietly. Then let's make it count. And for the first time, the bike didn't feel like something I was repairing. It felt like something we were co-authoring under pressure. The moment I placed my hand against the bike's exposed interface, I felt it respond in a way that was no longer subtle or interpretive, but immediate and unmistakable, as though whatever had been sleeping inside its systems had finally decided that restraint was no longer part of the equation. The pulse that ran through it this time wasn't just energy, it was recognition. Thalira's hand remained steady where it was, still anchoring the harmonization process, but I could feel the shift in the system as my presence was added to hers, like two separate signals being forced into alignment by a structure that was suddenly far more awake than either of us had intended to activate. For a fraction of a second, the diagnostics on my terminal didn't just update, they restructured. Lines of data collapsed into ordered frameworks I'd never seen before, rebuilding themselves around a central architecture that seemed to treat Thalira not as a user, not as an operator, but as a fixed point of authority within the system itself. Then, just beneath it, something else appeared. Not a classification this time, a response. Secondary node recognition detected. I frowned slightly. Secondary node? I muttered under my breath. Thalira's expression tightened just slightly at that, not in confusion, but in something closer to controlled surprise. That should not be active, she said quietly. Yeah, I replied, watching the readout shift again as the bike's internal systems surged into a more coherent operational state. You're going to have to narrow that down a bit. Another impact hit the bay doors, harder than before, and this time the breach widened enough that I could see the first outlines of security lighting spilling into the workshop corridor outside, cutting through the dim edges of the space like something searching for a shape it had already been told to expect. But the bike didn't react to them. It reacted to us. Thalira's hand pressed slightly firmer against the interface, and I realized she was no longer just initiating harmonization, but actively stabilizing something that was trying to complete itself faster than she could safely regulate. This is accelerating beyond controlled sync parameters, she said, her voice still calm, but now carrying the faintest strain of effort beneath it. Meaning? I asked, though I already had a feeling I wasn't going to like the answer. Meaning the system is attempting full integration through available conduits, she replied. I glanced down at my hand on the bike again. Which includes me, I said. A brief pause. Yes, she confirmed. That should have been the moment I pulled back, logically, instinctively, professionally. Instead, I adjusted my grip slightly, more out of stabilization than acceptance, and the system responded again, the pulse tightening into a steady rhythm that now felt less like activation and more like synchronization locking into place. Outside, the first security figure stepped through the breached bay doors and immediately stopped. Not because of us, because of what the system was doing. Their visor tilted slightly as their scanner attempted to process the workshop environment. But the moment it interfaced with the bike's active field, the feed distorted, flattening, recalibrating, and then hesitating in a way that suggested the system was encountering an identity it did not have permission to categorize. A second figure followed behind them, then a third, but none of them advanced further. Not yet. Thalira exhaled slowly, and for the first time since this began, I saw something like strain break through her composure. They are attempting external override, she said quietly. And is it going to work? I asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at me, really looked at me. And when she spoke, her voice was lower than before. Not if the harmonization completes first. Another surge ran through the bike, stronger now. And this time, the readout on my console expanded beyond anything I had seen since this entire mess began, unfolding layers of structured architecture that didn't feel built so much as declared into existence, with Thalira sitting at its center like a fixed coordinate that everything else was now trying to reference. And then it flickered, just once. A new line appeared beneath everything else, not from her system, not from the station, but from the bike itself, responding to the convergence. Co-anchor detected, Jack Rourke. I blinked at it. That's new, I said quietly. Thalira turned her head slightly toward the display, and for the first time since I'd met her, I saw uncertainty, not fear, not confusion, but genuine reassessment. That is not possible, she said softly. Another pulse. The system locked again. Harder this time, and outside, the security line finally made its decision and began to advance. But the bike, now fully awake in a way I was no longer sure could be called mechanical, responded before they could take another step. The workshop lights cut out completely, and when they returned a second later, they were no longer white. They were synchronized blue, bathing everything in a calm, controlled glow that felt like the system had just decided what reality was going to be for the next few minutes. The bay doors, still half destroyed, stopped creaking under pressure. The air itself seemed to settle, and the bike, still between us, gave a single steady pulse. Ready. Thalira's voice was barely above a whisper now. Jack! And for the first time, I understood that whatever she was, she had not expected me to become part of it. The blue light didn't flicker. It stabilized. That was the part that made it feel wrong in a way I couldn't immediately articulate because station lighting didn't stabilize under stress. It fluctuated, corrected, and fought to maintain baseline output. But this wasn't behaving like a system under pressure anymore. It was behaving like a system that had already decided what normal was going to be. The bike's pulse continued beneath my hand, steady now, no longer accelerating or reacting unpredictably, but maintaining a rhythm that felt less like activation and more like agreement between components that had finally stopped arguing with each other. The Lyra was still beside me, close enough that I could feel her presence without needing to look at her directly, though I did anyway, because something about the way she had said my name made it impossible not to. "Jack," she said again, quieter this time, as though testing the stability of the word itself. "This should not be occurring." "Yeah," I replied, watching the security figures outside the bay entrance as they remained exactly where they were, neither advancing nor retreating, as if their systems had reached a decision point they were no longer authorized to resolve on their own. I'm starting to get that impression. The co-anchor designation still sat on the display like a fact that had not yet been granted permission to exist. Jack Rourke, co-anchor detected. It didn't change. It didn't update. It didn't request clarification. It simply remained, as though the system had already accepted it and was now waiting for everyone else to catch up. Another pulse moved through the bike, and this time the entire structure of the workshop responded with it. Not physically, not violently, but structurally, like the environment itself had briefly aligned to a shared timing sequence that extended beyond mechanical systems and into something closer to environmental logic. Thalira shifted slightly, her hand still on the interface, but now with less force behind it. "I am losing primary control," she said quietly. "Is that bad?" I asked, though I already knew the answer wasn't going to be simple. "It is unexpected," she replied. A pause. Then she looked at me again, properly this time, not at the system, not at the bike, but at me, as though trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she believed should exist. "You are not registered within any governance architecture," she said. "I work in a workshop," I replied. "That's kind of the point." "That is not sufficient access to generate anchoring response." I gave a small shrug, still watching the security line outside. "Apparently it is today." The first real movement came from the security team again, but it wasn't forward motion this time. It was hesitation breaking. One of them raised their scanner, and I could see the moment it tried to reestablish classification on the bike's active field, only for the readout to distort again, as though the system was refusing to allow stable categorization of anything within range of the harmonization field. Thalira exhaled slowly, and this time I could hear it. Not relief. Adjustment. "They are attempting forced segmentation," she said. "Which means?" I asked. "It means they are trying to separate me from the system without collapsing the field." I glanced at her. "That sounds like it would hurt something," I said. "It would," she confirmed. Another pulse, stronger again. And this time the bike didn't just respond. It extended, not physically, but through the systems around it, as diagnostic overlays briefly flickered across nearby station infrastructure. Not as commands, but as reinterpretations of existing pathways. And then, the system did something neither of us had prompted. It acknowledged the external presence. Not the security team, not the breach, but the station itself. A new line appeared on my console, pushing everything else aside with quiet authority. "Operational realignment initiated." Thalira went still, completely still. "That is not me," she said quietly. I looked at her, then at the bike, then at the display. "That wasn't me either," I said. Outside, the security formation finally moved forward again, but slower now, not with confidence, but with systems that were clearly no longer receiving the same clarity of instruction they had been operating under moments before. And then the bike emitted a single, deeper pulse. Not activation, not escalation, decision. The bay doors, still fractured from the breach, stopped resisting entirely, not opening, not closing, just becoming irrelevant to what the system was now prioritizing. Thalira turned slightly toward me, and when she spoke, her voice had softened again, but in a different way than before. "This should not be possible without full registry alignment," she said. I gave a faint, almost disbelieving breath. "Yeah," I said quietly. "You've mentioned that a few times now." Her gaze held mine for a moment longer than it had any right to in the middle of everything happening around us. "And yet," she said. It is stabilizing around you. The system pulse continued. Steady dot controlled. Absolute. And somewhere in the structure of it, I realized something I hadn't wanted to fully acknowledge yet. This wasn't just allowing us to escape. It was deciding how reality was going to interpret us while we did it. Thalira stepped slightly closer to me again, not to the bike this time, but into the shared space between us where the system now seemed to treat proximity as relevance. Jack, she said quietly, if this completes synchronization fully, I may not be able to separate your identity from the field without a reset event. I blinked once. That sounds permanent, I said. It is potentially persistent, she corrected. A pause. Then, in the calmest voice she had used all day, I did not anticipate a co-anchor. I let out a slow breath, glanced at the security line that was still trying to decide whether it was allowed to proceed, then back at her. Yeah, I said. Join the club. And then the bike systems fully locked. Not louder, not brighter, just final. Ready. The moment the system locked into its final state, the change wasn't dramatic in the way I expected it to be. There was no surge, no alarm cascade, no visible collapse of station security protocols. Instead, everything simply aligned. The blue light held steady across the workshop, and then, almost politely, it extended outward through the breached bay doors as though the boundary itself had been reassigned rather than broken. The security team outside stopped moving entirely. Not frozen, not stunned, just paused, mid-intention, as if the concept of advancing any further had been temporarily removed from their available options. One of them tilted their head slightly, visor flickering, as their systems attempted to reconcile operational orders with environmental feedback that no longer matched any valid enforcement category. And then, one by one, their weapons lowered. Not because they were told to, because something deeper in the system had quietly stopped recognizing them as relevant variables. I didn't say anything at first. I wasn't sure I was supposed to. The bike remained between Thalira and me, still active, still alive in that strange, structured way that no longer felt like mechanical engineering, so much as enforced consensus between systems that had agreed to stop disagreeing. Then the console in front of me updated again, not with a warning, not with a request, with a confirmation. Access frame restructure complete. Below it, the previous designation remained, but it had changed in a way that made my stomach tighten slightly when I realized what I was looking at. Jack Rourke, co-anchor detected to temporary operator alignment granted. I frowned. Temporary operator alignment? I muttered. Thalira read it at the same time, and for the first time, her composure didn't just strain. It reframed itself, as if she was actively trying to reinterpret what she was seeing without letting it destabilize her understanding of how the system was supposed to behave. That is not an authorized cast designation, she said quietly. I don't even know what that means, I replied. But even as I said it, I felt it. Not in the bike exactly, not in the console, in the environment. The workshop lighting subtly adjusted its angle in response to my position, not following movement, but anticipating intent, as though the system now considered my presence part of its decision architecture rather than just an external input. Outside, one of the security officers finally stepped forward again, only to stop halfway through the motion as their visor abruptly filled with interference patterns that looked less like a malfunction and more like a refusal. Thalira's hand shifted slightly on the interface, but this time the response from the bike wasn't escalation. It was permission alignment. I am no longer initiating primary control, she said softly. I glanced at her. That sounds like you're handing it over, I said. I'm not handing it over, she replied, her voice steady but now noticeably more careful. The system is redistributing authority based on co-anchor convergence. Which is me, I said. Yes, she confirmed. A pause hung between us for a moment, heavier than anything the security breach outside could produce. Then she added, quieter, that should not be possible. I gave a short, humorless breath. You've said that one a lot today. The bike responded again, but differently this time, not with a pulse, with a map. A full spatial reconstruction of the surrounding station infrastructure unfolded across my console, but instead of raw schematics, it was layered with active pathways, routes that were not simply available, but sanctioned, as though the station itself had begun offering suggestions. One of them highlighted automatically, a direct path through the breached bay. No resistance points. No security nodes flagged as active threats. Just open corridor logic. As if the station had quietly decided that preventing our departure was no longer within its operational priorities. Thalira saw it too. That route is not standard evacuation protocol, she said. It looks like it wants us to leave, I replied. It is not the station that wants anything, she corrected. But even as she said it, her tone lacked certainty, because the system didn't feel like the station anymore. It felt like something layered on top of it, using it. Outside, the security line finally broke formation, not in panic, but in confusion, as their coordination net began to fragment under conflicting instruction pathways that no longer resolved into a single actionable command. And for the first time, they looked less like an enforcement unit, and more like people waiting for a system that had forgotten how to speak to them. The bike emitted a final stabilizing pulse, not activation, not escalation, invitation. The path ahead of us through the bay doors lit up in the same controlled blue as everything else, forming a corridor that didn't push reality away. It simply clarified it. Thalira looked at me, properly, not as an engineer, not as a co-anchor, but as someone trying to understand what had just been placed beside her in the structure of the system. You did not trigger this, she said quietly. I glanced at the open path ahead. Didn't feel like I did, I admitted. A pause. Then she spoke again, softer. And yet, the system behaves as if it requires your presence to maintain stability. I let out a slow breath. That makes two of us confused then. For the first time since this began, she almost smiled. Almost. And then she stepped forward. Not away from me, not toward the bike, but into the corridor the system had opened for both of us. And I followed. Because whatever this was, it had already decided we were leaving. The moment Thalira stepped into the illuminated corridor, the bike reacted again, not by following, but by repositioning itself, sliding forward across the workshop floor with a controlled, almost weightless motion that suggested it no longer considered friction or physical resistance to be particularly relevant concepts. It came to a stop beside us, perfectly aligned, as though it had already calculated the exact point at which we would both decide to stop pretending we were still separate from it. Thalira hesitated for only a fraction of a second before placing her hand on the frame again, but this time there was no attempt to initiate control, only acceptance of motion. I followed her lead, climbing onto the bike behind her without needing instruction, because the system itself seemed to anticipate the action before I fully committed to it, adjusting its balance field the moment my weight shifted into place. For an instant, everything outside the immediate space around us felt distant, almost irrelevant, as though the station itself had receded slightly to make room for whatever this configuration of us was becoming. Then the console updated again, but this time it didn't feel like a system message, it felt like a direction. Operational vector established, movement required. Thalira's posture tightened slightly as she read it. This is not standard escape routing, she said quietly. No, I replied, adjusting my grip as the bike subtly stabilized beneath us. It feels more like it's deciding where we're supposed to exist next. A faint pause followed that, and I could tell she didn't like the implication. But she didn't deny it. The corridor ahead of us shifted, not physically, but structurally, as the station's lighting and environmental systems reconfigured themselves into a continuous path that extended far beyond the breached bay doors, threading through maintenance arteries and transit gaps that I was fairly sure did not normally exist in any publicly accessible layout. The bike pulsed once, and then moved, smoothly, quietly, with no sense of acceleration so much as relocation, as if distance was something the system was politely choosing to ignore in order to reduce inconvenience. We passed through the bay threshold, and the security team outside finally moved again, but not in pursuit. In confusion. Their systems were no longer synchronized with the same version of the station we were now traveling through. One of them raised a hand as if to signal, but the gesture lagged half a second behind the moment it should have mattered, and then the corridor simply carried us past them, dissolving their relevance as cleanly as it had dissolved resistance. Thalira exhaled slowly, and I felt her shift slightly in front of me. Not fear, not hesitation, recalculation. "This is escalating beyond any registered asset behavior I have ever observed," she said. "Is that your polite way of saying we shouldn't be doing this?" I asked. "I am saying," she replied carefully, "that I did not design anything in my systems to allow this level of autonomous environmental negotiation." That made me glance at her. "Your systems?" I repeated. A brief silence followed, a fraction too long, and for the first time, I noticed something I hadn't properly registered before, not just her composure or her precision, or the way she understood the bike too quickly for someone supposedly encountering it under emergency conditions, but the absence of any real limitation in how she interacted with the system itself. The bike pulsed again, softer now, almost like it was listening. And then her console flickered, not with station data, but with internal authentication layers that had no business appearing in a maintenance class interface. A new label unfolded beneath everything else, slower this time, as though the system was being careful not to overwhelm its own understanding of what it was displaying. "Primary Economic Authority identifier detected," I frowned. "Economic Authority?" I said. Thalira didn't respond immediately, which in my experience so far was never a good sign. The corridor ahead of us bent again, but this time I realized it wasn't the station adjusting to us. It was adjusting to her. "Thalira," I said slowly, "what exactly are you?" Her voice when it came was quieter than before. "I am not meant to be classified in active operational environments," she said. "That's not an answer." A pause. Then, finally, "I hold controlling interest in multiple transit infrastructure guilds across 3 connected systems." I blinked. "You're joking." "I am not." Another pulse from the bike, smoother now, more certain. The station corridor ahead of us restructured again, but this time it felt less like a path opening and more like a system recognizing ownership. Like it had just realized who it had been speaking to, and next to that recognition, mine, still sitting there, still unresolved, still marked, co-anchor, temporary operator alignment. The bike accelerated gently, carrying us deeper into the station's internal layers, as if it had finally decided that distance was no longer a meaningful barrier between decisions. Thalira's voice softened slightly. "This should not be happening," she said again, and for the first time it didn't sound like a complaint. It sounded like she was trying to understand why it was happening around me. The deeper we moved into the station's internal structure, the more the environment stopped behaving like architecture and started behaving like a responsive extension of the bike itself. Corridors didn't so much open as they did resolve, shifting their internal priorities the moment we approached, rerouting physical pathways and environmental locks as though our presence had been assigned a level of clearance that predated the station's current security framework. There was no resistance anymore, only reorganization. Thalira remained steady in front of me, her posture still composed, but I could feel the subtle change in her stillness now, not the calm of control, but the focus of someone observing a system that was no longer behaving within expected parameters of ownership or hierarchy. The bike continued forward at a constant, unhurried pace, yet every meter we traveled felt less like movement and more like the station agreeing to reinterpret its own internal map in real time. Then the console shifted again, not an alert, not a warning, a structural elevation. "Operational node status updated." For a moment, neither of us spoke, because the implication wasn't subtle anymore. Thalira finally broke the silence first. "This is not transit behavior," she said quietly. "No," I replied, watching as a junction ahead of us reorganized itself into a direct forward route without any physical mechanism to justify the change. "It feels like we're being treated as part of the control layer." A faint pause. Then she said carefully, "That is not supposed to be possible for a mobile asset." The bike pulsed once beneath us, not in response to her words, but as if acknowledging them without requiring permission. And then the station responded, not with alarms, not with pursuit, but with integration. The corridor ahead of us expanded into a broader transit channel, lights adjusting in sequence along the ceiling like a chain reaction of decisions being made faster than any single authority grid should have been capable of coordinating. It was no longer just guiding us. It was routing everything through us. A new interface layer unfolded on my console, but this time it didn't sit on top of the system. It became the system's interface. A branching schematic of station-wide infrastructure appeared, except instead of being something we were moving through, it now looked like something we were quietly sitting inside the middle of, and at the center of it, us, or more accurately, the bike. Thalira's eyes narrowed slightly as she read the updated structure. "This is impossible without central authority handover," she said. I glanced at her. "Central authority of what?" I asked. She hesitated, and that hesitation told me more than the answer would have. "The station's transit governance layer," she said finally. "If this is accurate, then we are no longer within a route." I frowned slightly. "What are we in, then?" Thalira looked forward as the corridor reshaped itself again, smoother now, more refined, as if anticipating her attempt to categorize it. "We are in the routing core," she said. The bike pulsed again, stronger this time, and the station reacted immediately. Entire sections of infrastructure beyond our visible path began synchronizing in cascading sequence, not opening routes but preparing them. Like a vast machine reconfiguring itself around a moving command point it had decided was legitimate. The sensation was subtle, but unmistakable. We were no longer being escorted. We were being obeyed. Thalira's voice dropped slightly. "This should only respond to Executive Transit Authority," she said. I let out a quiet breath. "Yeah," I replied. "That's starting to sound like your department." Another pause, then she added softer. "It is not responding to mine." That made me look at her properly. And for the first time since this began, there was something in her expression that wasn't calculation or control or controlled composure. It was reassessment, not of the system, of me. The bike continued forward, unhurried and absolute, as the station around us restructured itself in real time, turning entire corridors, junctions, and enforcement nodes into secondary processes that existed only to support the path we were already taking. And somewhere deep in the system, beneath transit layers, beneath security architecture, beneath governance structures that were never meant to overlap, something finally registered the truth. A mobile command node had not been deployed. It had formed, and it was moving. The deeper we moved into the routing core, the more the station stopped behaving like a constructed environment and started behaving like a layered decision engine that had forgotten it was ever supposed to feel static. Every corridor we passed through was no longer a fixed structure, but a temporary agreement between systems that were continuously rewriting themselves in response to our position. Thalira remained focused in front of me, but I could feel the change in her attention now. It wasn't directed outward anymore. It was turning inward, into the system, into the bike, and increasingly, into me. Her console shifted again, and this time she didn't speak immediately, which was never a good sign. "What is it?" I asked quietly. She hesitated, just long enough for me to notice. "I am attempting to isolate the origin point of your operator alignment signature," she said. I frowned slightly. "My what?" "The system is treating you as a valid routing participant," she continued, her voice tightening with controlled focus. "But your biological and occupational profile does not contain any known access vector that would permit co-anchor emergence." I let out a slow breath. "I fix engines," I said. "I don't think that usually qualifies as system-level architecture exposure." "That is what I am trying to understand," she replied. The bike pulsed beneath us again, softer this time, but with a deeper structural resonance that rippled outward through the surrounding transit layer. And then the station responded. Not locally, not in segments, but globally. The corridor ahead of us expanded into a long, continuous transit spine, and for the first time I could see beyond immediate routing adjustments and into something far larger, an entire network of interconnected station layers subtly shifting into a new configuration that revolved around a single moving point. Us. Or, more precisely, the bike. A new system directive unfolded across my console, but it didn't arrive like previous messages. It arrived like a decision already made. Routing core stability threshold exceeded. A second line followed immediately beneath it. Initiating structural rebalance protocol. Thalira went still. Not frozen, calculating. "This is not standard failover behavior," she said quietly. "No kidding," I muttered, watching as entire branches of station infrastructure began dimming and reconfiguring in sequence ahead of us, like a map erasing itself and redrawing from a different starting assumption. But she wasn't looking at the station anymore. Her attention had narrowed completely onto me. "Jack," she said slowly, "your alignment signature is not being granted by the system." I glanced at her. "Then what is it doing?" Her expression tightened slightly. "It is being derived." That word sat in the space between us longer than it should have. Derived wasn't access. It wasn't permission. It wasn't classification. It was something the system had inferred on its own. Something it had constructed based on interaction patterns it couldn't otherwise resolve. The bike pulsed again, stronger, and the station reacted instantly, not by opening more routes, but by simplifying itself. Entire sections of transit structure collapsed inward, not physically destroyed, but abstracted away, removed from active relevance as if the system had decided those pathways were no longer necessary for any outcome involving us. Thalira's voice lowered slightly. "The system is reducing complexity," she said. "It is removing non-essential structural branches to prioritize a single coherent outcome path." I looked forward. The corridor ahead of us was no longer branching at all. It was becoming a single, uninterrupted vector, a straight line through layers of station infrastructure that should have been impossible to traverse without clearance at multiple governance levels. "Which outcome?" I asked. She didn't answer immediately, because the answer was already unfolding in front of us. The bike pulsed again, and this time, the entire routing core responded in synchronized agreement. Not with expansion, not with escalation, with commitment. A full station-wide structural rebalancing initiated around us, collapsing conflicting transit logic into one continuous directive, stripping away anything that resisted alignment until only a single operational truth remained. Movement forward. Thalira finally spoke, quieter now. "It is selecting continuity over stability," she said. I glanced at her. "That sounds bad." "It is efficient," she corrected, then hesitated. "But it is also irreversible if allowed to complete." Another pulse ran through the bike, deeper than before, and I could feel the change in the environment around us now. The station wasn't just routing us anymore. It was beginning to assume that everything else should adapt to ensure we remained uninterrupted. Thalira's gaze sharpened again, and I could see her actively pulling data streams apart in real time now, chasing something buried beneath the system's visible architecture. And then she found it. Her voice dropped. "There is no predefined co-anchor class in the original design," she said. I frowned. "Then why am I here?" Her eyes flicked to me again, properly, sharply, as if recalibrating what she was seeing. "That is what I am trying to determine," she said. "Because the system is not treating you as an anomaly." A pause. "It is treating you as a necessary condition." The bike surged forward again, not faster, but more decisively, as the station completed another layer of its structural reconfiguration. And somewhere deep within the routing core, something locked into place. Not because it had been activated, but because it had finally finished deciding what it was supposed to become. The station did not open a conventional exit. There was no docking sequence, no airlock cycle, no environmental separation warning. Instead, the routing core simply reached a point where physical infrastructure ceased to be the most efficient continuation path, and so it stopped treating it as a requirement. The corridor ahead of us narrowed into a single, uninterrupted vector of light and structural alignment, and then, without any visible mechanical transition, the boundary of the station began to thin, not break, not decompress. Thin, as though the idea of inside was being gradually phased out of relevance. Thalira stiffened slightly in front of me. "This is not a sanctioned external transition," she said quietly. "No kidding," I muttered, watching the structural layers ahead begin to dissolve into something that looked less like architecture and more like layered probability fields. The bike pulsed once beneath us, and for the first time, it didn't feel like it was responding to the station. It felt like it was negotiating with the concept of vacuum itself. A new interface layer unfolded across my console, but this one didn't display routes or systems. It displayed conditions. External environment detected, life support adaptation required. I frowned. "That sounds like a bad sign," I said. Thalira's voice was quieter now, but controlled. It is preparing for exposure beyond structural containment, she replied. Before I could respond, the bike shifted beneath us, not in movement, in redefinition. The frame expanded outward in a slow, deliberate bloom of adaptive material, not mechanical components, but layered fields of structured energy and matter synthesis, unfolding around us like a system deciding that its original form was no longer sufficient for continued operation. I felt it wrap upward first, around my back, shoulders, and chest, not restraining, but enclosing, like the system was building a boundary that understood exactly where I ended and everything else began. Thalira reacted at the same moment, not with alarm, with recognition. "This is a full environmental encapsulation protocol," she said, her tone tightening slightly as the structure formed around her as well. "But it is not standard military grade. This is adaptive continuity architecture." I glanced at her through the forming field. "Meaning?" I asked. "It is not just protecting us," she replied. "It is maintaining us as a single operational system." The encasement sealed with a soft, almost imperceptible resonance, and suddenly sound changed. Air pressure became irrelevant. Temperature stabilized to a neutral equilibrium that didn't feel like heat or cold, just controlled existence. The station around us was still there, but now it felt distant, as if we were no longer fully occupying the same layer of reality. Thalira's gaze shifted forward again, watching the last structural boundary of the station thinning ahead of us. "This should require full biosignature authorization from an external authority grid," she said quietly. I let out a breath. "Yeah," I replied. "We've established that Chud isn't really in charge anymore." The bike pulsed again, and this time the boundary gave way. Not explosively, not dramatically, just acceptance of transition. The station fell behind us in layers, like a constructed thought being left unresolved. And then there was space, not emptiness, not silence. Just an entirely different environmental logic system unfolding around us, infinite and unstructured compared to the ordered architecture we had just left. The bike stabilized instantly, its encapsulation field adjusting to the vacuum conditions without hesitation, as though it had already simulated this outcome long before we reached it. Thalira exhaled slowly, and for the first time, her composure shifted into something closer to disbelief. "We are outside station infrastructure," she said quietly. I looked out into the vastness ahead. "Yeah," I said, "feels like it." Another pulse moved through the bike, but this one was different, because now there was no station left to respond, only us. And whatever the system decided, we were supposed to be out here. The moment the station fell completely behind us, space didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a transition the system had stopped bothering to label. The bike stabilized instantly in the vacuum, its encapsulation field holding firm around us, not just maintaining life support, but actively recalibrating it as though survival was just another configurable parameter in a much larger operational framework. And then it did something that made the quiet between us feel heavier. It moved. Not forward in the way engines move through thrust or propulsion, but as if it had selected a destination that already existed and was simply aligning itself with a route that space had not yet expressed. Thalira noticed it at the exact same time I did. "This is not inertial navigation," she said quietly. "No," I replied, watching the subtle distortions ahead of us as a faint structural threads began forming in the emptiness. "It feels like it already knows where it's going." A pause followed. But it wasn't the system that filled it this time. It was her. And for the first time since I'd met her, Thalira's composure didn't just soften, it fractured into something more human beneath it. "I chose this station deliberately," she said. I glanced at her. That wasn't what I had been expecting. "You what?" I asked. Her gaze stayed forward, fixed on the emerging path ahead of us, but her voice lowered slightly. "I was not assigned here by transit governance," she continued. "I arrived here because I was tracking an irregularity in an external asset network that had begun destabilizing closed-loop routing systems." I frowned. "Let me guess," I said. "That's me?" A brief silence. "Yes," she admitted. The bike adjusted slightly beneath us, as if acknowledging the statement without needing to participate in the emotional weight of it. Thalira exhaled slowly. You were not supposed to be accessible, she said. Your profile did not exist in any economic, military, or infrastructural registry I control. I gave a small, humorless breath. I'm a mechanic, I said again. That is what made you visible, she replied quietly. That made me pause. The path ahead of us in space sharpened slightly, like a line being drawn through nothingness. Thalira finally turned her head just enough to look at me, not fully, but enough. I believed the anomaly was in the station, she said, in the bike, in the routing collapse event. Another pause, then more quietly, I did not expect it to be anchored to a person. The bike pulsed once beneath us, not reacting, confirming. And then, for the first time since everything began, I noticed something subtle in the system feed. Not a designation, not a command. A relationship mapping layer beginning to form between two nodes. Node link established between Jack Rourke and Thalira. I frowned at it. That looks like a bad idea, I muttered. Thalira almost smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I agree, she said softly, which is why I did not authorize it. That made me look at her properly. You didn't authorize it? No, she said. The system did. The bike shifted again, and the path ahead of us in space extended further, like it was deciding that distance itself was simply a matter of continued permission. I hesitated before asking the next question. So why were you really there? That time, she didn't answer immediately. When she finally did, her voice was quieter than before. I have been maintaining structural continuity across 3 transit systems for longer than most people realize, she said. I blinked. That's the millionaire's thing, right? I asked. A pause. Yes, she said simply. Then she continued. And my role requires me to ensure that no single routing intelligence becomes capable of self-referencing autonomy without oversight. I frowned. So you were there to shut this down? Yes. Another pause. And instead, she added, I became part of it. The bike pulsed again, and I felt it. Subtle, but unmistakable. The system was not just mapping a destination anymore. It was integrating us both into its decision structure for how to reach it. Thalira finally looked at me fully now, and her voice, when it came, was quieter still. There is something else I did not tell you, she said. I sighed slightly. Yeah, I said. I'm starting to expect that at this point. Her gaze held mine. My systems do not interface with external machinery without a stabilizing bridge protocol, she said. I frowned. And I'm guessing I'm not a licensed bridge protocol. A pause. No, she said, you are not licensed for anything you are currently doing. That almost made me laugh. Almost. Then she added, but when you placed your hand on the bike, her voice softened slightly. It stopped trying to kill me. The silence that followed that wasn't system-generated. It was just us. And for the first time, I understood something wasn't just happening to us. It was happening between us. The bike pulsed again. And somewhere deeper in its structure, a new layer activated, one I hadn't seen before. Not navigation, not routing, not survival. Continuity priority, dual node stabilization. And as the path through space extended ahead of us, it didn't feel like escape anymore. It felt like something had decided we were no longer separable variables. The path through space continued to unfold ahead of us, not as a tunnel or a corridor, but as a subtle restructuring of direction itself. Like reality was no longer presenting distance as an obstacle, but as a negotiable suggestion that could be resolved in real time. The bike followed it without hesitation, not accelerating, not correcting, simply agreeing with whatever logic now governed forward movement. For a while, neither of us spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because whatever was happening between us and the system felt like it was still stabilizing into something that language might accidentally disturb if we tried to define it too early. Then, Thalira exhaled slowly. Not the controlled kind of breath I had grown used to from her. Something lighter, less defended. I did not come to that station only because of the anomaly, she said. I didn't respond immediately. I just listened, because her tone had changed. I came, she continued, because I had been tracking routing instability patterns across multiple systems for months, and every convergence point eventually traced back to something that should not have been statistically possible. The bike adjusted slightly beneath us, as if settling into a more stable interpretation of her voice. "And that was me?" I asked quietly. A pause. "Yes," she admitted, but this time there was no distance in the word. Just fact. Her gaze remained forward, watching the structure of space ahead of us continue to reorganize itself into a coherent path. "I did not believe it was a person at first," she said. I gave a faint, humorless breath. "Yeah, I'm getting that a lot today." That almost pulled a reaction from her, something close to amusement, but it faded before it could fully form. "I thought it was a corrupted autonomous system fragment," she continued. "A recursive routing intelligence emerging from outdated transit infrastructure." I glanced at her. "That sounds flattering," I said. "It was not meant to be," she replied, but her voice had softened further now. The bike pulsed gently again, as if acknowledging the exchange. And then the system feed updated, not loudly, not dramatically, just with quiet certainty. "Anomaly source confirmed. Jack Rourke. Non-registered system influence vector." One Thalira watched it for a moment. Then she spoke again, quieter this time. "I was assigned to eliminate that possibility." I turned slightly toward her. "Eliminate?" I repeated. She nodded once. "I was authorized to collapse the origin point if it proved to be a self-expanding routing instability." The words landed between us differently than anything before it. Not as threat, as history. Then she added, even softer, "But I did not." I frowned slightly. Why not? For the first time since I'd met her, Thalira hesitated in a way that wasn't analytical. It was personal. "I reached the station," she said slowly, "and I found the anomaly interacting with a mechanical system that should have been completely incompatible with its signal structure." A pause. Her voice lowered. "And instead of destabilizing the system," she glanced at me now, "you stabilized it." The bike responded immediately to that statement, extending the forward path through space another layer, as if confirming the direction that idea had opened. Thalira's expression shifted slightly, something more vulnerable passing beneath her controlled exterior. "That is why I did not act," she said, "because the system did something I did not predict." I studied her for a moment. "And what was that?" I asked. Her answer came quietly. "It trusted you." The silence that followed was different from before, heavier in one way, but less tense in another. Because it wasn't the system pressing on us now, it was the implication of what it had already decided. The bike pulsed again, steady and calm, as if continuing a route it had no intention of reconsidering. And somewhere deep within its architecture, the link between us reappeared, clearer this time. Not just data, not just classification, a living connection the system was actively maintaining. Node link established between Jack Rourke and Thalira. This time, neither of us commented on it immediately. Thalira finally spoke first. "I did not come to stop you," she said quietly. I looked at her. "No." She shook her head slightly. "I came because I wanted to understand why something like you could exist without collapsing under its own impossibility." A pause. "And now?" I asked. Her gaze held mine a little longer this time. "Now," she said softly, "I am no longer sure you are the anomaly." The bike pulsed once, and the path ahead of us in space sharpened again, pulling us deeper into whatever destination it had already decided was waiting. But this time, it didn't feel like being taken somewhere. It felt like being understood into motion. The forward path didn't just continue now. It refined. Each step through space felt less like movement and more like agreement, like reality itself was reducing ambiguity the closer we got to whatever lay ahead. The bike's presence beneath us remained steady, but it no longer felt like a machine responding to input. It felt like something participating in a decision it had already made. Thalira was quiet for a long moment. Not the analytical silence I was used to from her, something heavier, something internal. Then she spoke, and her voice carried a different kind of weight than before. "I need to correct something," she said. I glanced at her. "That sounds ominous," I replied. A faint pause. "It is not," she said. "It is overdue." She looked forward again as the space ahead of us continued to restructure itself into a defined trajectory. "When I said I was sent to eliminate the anomaly," she continued, "that was only partially accurate." I frowned slightly. "Only partially is usually where the worst parts live," I muttered. That earned the smallest exhale from her, almost a laugh, but restrained by habit rather than emotion. "I was sent to observe first," she said, "to determine whether the anomaly was a system fault or something emergent." A pause. "And if it was emergent?" I asked quietly. Thalira didn't answer immediately. That hesitation mattered more than the words would have. "If it was emergent," she said finally, "I was instructed to ensure it did not become self-aware enough to propagate." The air between us felt different after that. Not tense, just recontextualized. The bike gave a soft pulse beneath us, as if acknowledging that statement and quietly disagreeing with its premise. Thalira's gaze lowered slightly. "But I did not classify you as a system," she said. I looked at her. "No?" She shook her head. "I could not." Another pause. Her voice softened. "Because systems do not destabilize when they are observed." That landed quietly. Then she added, "And they do not make me feel like I am being observed back." The path ahead of us tightened again, narrowing into a precise vector through the emptiness, as if responding to the emotional weight of that admission by making direction itself more certain. I exhaled slowly. "That sounds like a bad design flaw in your job," I said. "It was," she replied. A pause. Then quieter. "That is why I left." I turned to look at her more fully now. That was the first real fracture in her story I hadn't seen coming. "You left?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "My authority, my holdings, my oversight structures. I stepped away from all of it." A beat. "I told myself it was to investigate the anomaly properly." Her eyes shifted slightly toward me. "But that was not the full reason." The bike pulsed again, and this time the system feed didn't just update. It expanded, not outward, but inward, like it was adding depth rather than distance. "Dual node integration active, Jack Rourke and Thalira." I frowned at it. "That still feels like a joint custody situation I didn't consent to," I muttered. Thalira's expression softened again, but there was something more fragile beneath it now. "I began experiencing a fault in my own stabilization core," she said quietly. That made me pause. "A fault?" I repeated. She nodded once. "My augmentations are designed to regulate emotional interference, to prevent decision-making degradation in high-level routing authority roles." A beat. "And they're failing?" I asked. "Yes." The word was simple, but it explained everything in a way neither of us had fully said yet. The controlled composure, the precision, the way she watched everything like it might become too meaningful if she wasn't careful. She continued, quieter now. "It began when I traced the anomaly signature too closely." Her gaze shifted toward me. "And it worsened when I reached the source." I didn't speak because I already understood where this was going. "I expected a system," she said. A pause. "But I found you." The bike responded immediately, a deeper pulse this time. Not warning, recognition. The forward path through space sharpened again, but now it didn't feel like direction alone. It felt like conclusion assembling itself in real time. Thalira inhaled slowly. "And when I was with you," she said, "the stabilization failure did not worsen." Her voice dropped slightly. "It adapted." Silence. Then the system feed changed again. "Anomaly harmonic response detected. Stabilization interface. Jack Rourke compatibility confirmed." I stared at it. "I'm starting to think I'm not just a mechanic anymore," I said quietly. Thalira looked at me properly now, for longer this time. "You are not," she said. The bike pulsed once more, and then the destination finally revealed itself, not as coordinates, but as recognition. A point in space that wasn't being approached, but waiting, as if it had already accounted for both of us arriving together. "Final route confirmed. Dual node required for access." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was expectation. And for the first time since all of this began, it didn't feel like we were being taken somewhere unknown. It felt like something out there already knew our names. The forward path didn't feel like distance anymore. It felt like confirmation. Each incremental shift through space tightened the same conclusion, as if reality itself was collapsing uncertainty the closer we got to whatever waited ahead. The bike no longer chose direction. It simply stopped resisting what was already inevitable. Thalira remained still beside me, but I could sense it now. That subtle recalibration happening within her stabilization systems, like something inside her was trying to adjust to a variable it had never been designed to account for, and failing, not catastrophically, but persistently. "You're thinking about it," I said quietly. She didn't look away from the path ahead. "Yes," she admitted. "Me?" I asked. A pause. "Yes." That answer landed heavier than it should have. Before I could respond, the space ahead of us shifted, not visually, structurally, like the universe had stopped pretending distance was infinite and instead began resolving itself into architecture. The bike slowed, not because it needed to, but because what lay ahead was no longer part of route optimization. It was arrival logic. And then we saw it. At first, it didn't register as a structure. It registered as absence arranged with intention. A vast formation suspended in space, not built, but expressed, like something had taken raw emptiness and convinced it to hold shape. Thalira went completely still beside me. "That shouldn't exist," she whispered. The bike pulsed once, then again, slower, as if recognizing something it had not been designed to explain, and then the system feed changed. But this time, it didn't present data. It reacted. "Origin structure detected." A pause, then another line appeared beneath it, one neither of us had seen before. "Primary routing construct, Jack Rourke signature lock." I frowned hard. "That's not possible," I said. Thalira turned slightly toward the display. Her voice was quieter now. "That is not a system designation," she said. "That is an origin key." The bike drifted closer, and as we approached, something in the structure ahead of us responded. Not lights, not signals. Recognition. The vast construct noticed us noticing it, and it adjusted, like it had been waiting for a specific configuration of presence to validate its next state. Thalira's hand tightened slightly at her side. "I have seen Imperial routing cores," she said quietly. "I have seen transit intelligences that span 3 systems." A pause. "But I have never seen anything that responds to a human being as a prerequisite condition." That word stuck. Prerequisite. I looked at the structure again, and for the first time I felt something I couldn't explain. Not fear, not awe, more like familiarity without memory, like seeing a place I had never been told I was from. The bike gave a low, steady pulse, and then the system feed changed again, slower this time, almost careful. Access condition met, Jack Rourke present. A beat. Then, "Welcome back." I froze. "No," I said under my breath. "No, that's wrong." Thalira looked at me now, properly. For the first time since all of this began, her composure wasn't just cracked. It was openly uncertain. "You have never been here?" she asked. "No," I said immediately. But even as I said it, the structure ahead of us seemed unconvinced, because it responded again, and this time, it did not speak to the system. It spoke to me, not in words, in recognition pressure. Like something deep in the architecture was aligning itself around a missing piece, finally returning to position. Thalira's voice dropped slightly. "Jack," she said carefully, "your presence is resolving inconsistencies in the construct's state." I swallowed slightly. "I don't even know what that means," I admitted. The bike drifted closer again, and for the first time, I noticed something embedded in its interface layer that hadn't been there before, a label, not generated, not computed, but inherited. Core function, Rourke-class anchor node. Thalira went very still. "Anchor node?" she repeated quietly. The structure ahead of us responded again, and this time the answer wasn't displayed. It was enacted. A section of the impossible architecture unfolded, not opening like doors, but resolving like a thought finally being completed. And in that moment, the truth started to take shape without needing to be fully spoken yet. The system hadn't found Jack. It had been built around something that eventually became him. And it had been waiting for him to stop being unaware long enough to return. Thalira looked at me again, and her voice, when it came, was almost unreadable. "If you are an anchor node," she said quietly, "then you are not interacting with the system." A pause. "You are what holds it in place." The bike pulsed once more, and for the first time, it felt like it agreed with her. The structure ahead of us didn't open further. It didn't need to. It was already responding. Not like a machine executing commands, but like something long dormant finally registering that a missing condition had returned to the system state. The bike slowed as we approached, but even that felt symbolic now, less like deceleration and more like deference. Thalira didn't move for a long moment. Then she spoke quietly. "This is not a facility," she said. I glanced at her. "What is it then?" I asked. She hesitated, eyes fixed on the impossible architecture ahead. "A compliance structure," she said, "or what remains of one." That didn't mean anything to me in the way it clearly meant something to her. But before I could push further, the system responded. Not the bike, not Thalira's augment feed. The structure itself. And this time it didn't display information in clean, readable lines. It reconstructed context around us. Anchor node detected. A pause. Then, router class entity, Jack Rourke, present. I frowned immediately. "I'm not a router class anything," I said. But even as I said it, the words felt slightly out of phase, like they belonged to someone describing me rather than me denying it. Thalira turned toward me now, properly, and for the first time her expression wasn't analytical. It was careful. "Jack," she said slowly, "your biological signature is not registered in any civilian classification network." I gave a short breath. "That's not exactly my fault," I muttered. "No," she said quietly. "It is not." A pause. Then she added something that changed the air between us. "It is older than those systems." The structure ahead of us shifted again, not opening, not unlocking, aligning, like it had been waiting for something to step into position so it could stop holding itself in a fragmented state. The bike pulsed once beneath us, and for the first time, I felt something underneath it, not mechanical response, but structural acknowledgement. Like it was recognizing me as a component it had already depended on. Thalira's voice lowered slightly. "I have spent my entire life interfacing with regulated transit intelligences," she said. "They operate on strict hierarchy, access control, and governed autonomy thresholds." She hesitated. "But this," she gestured faintly toward the structure, "is not governed." A beat. "It is remembering." That word landed harder than it should have. Before I could respond, the system feed changed again, and this time it did not feel like observation. It felt like restoration. Memory layer integration initiated, Jack Rourke. I stiffened slightly. "Integration?" I repeated. Thalira's eyes narrowed. "That should not be possible without consent protocol," she said quickly. But even as she spoke, her voice lost certainty, because the structure wasn't asking permission. It was restoring continuity, not downloading information into me, but pulling me back into alignment with something already inside the system's memory of me. And then, a flicker. Not a vision exactly, more like a fragment of structural familiarity trying to surface through layers of suppression. A vast control lattice, transit arteries spanning systems, central routing intelligence that didn't feel artificial, just familiar in a way I couldn't justify. And at the center of it, a designation I couldn't fully see. Just the shape of it. Like my name, but not the version I had ever been told belonged to me. I stumbled slightly in place. Thalira moved instantly closer. "Jack." "Steady," she said, but her voice had changed now. Sharper, concerned, because her own stabilization interface was reacting. Violently. Her augment core was spiking, not failing randomly anymore, but responding to me. Like proximity to whatever I was unlocking was forcing her systems into resonance. I started. But the sentence didn't finish cleanly. Because the structure responded again, and this time it didn't just speak. It corrected reality. Anchor node status confirmed. A pause, then system integrity restored upon return. The bike pulsed in perfect synchrony with the structure, and Thalira finally said the part she had been resisting since the moment this started. "Jack," she said quietly, "you are not interacting with this system." I looked at her, and for the first time, she didn't look like she was trying to understand me. She looked like she was trying to accept what understanding would mean. "You are part of its original architecture. Silence. Not empty. Complete." The structure ahead of us finished aligning, and for the first time since we arrived, it didn't feel like we were being observed. It felt like we had arrived inside something that had been incomplete without us. The silence didn't last. It never did around something that had just decided you belonged inside it. The structure ahead of us didn't open like a doorway. It unfolded like recognition becoming physical. Layer by layer, what had looked like impossible architecture began resolving into something closer to a system that had stopped pretending it was still incomplete. And the moment it fully acknowledged our presence, the bike reacted, not by accelerating, but by synchronizing. Its hum deepened into a steady harmonic tone that matched the structure's own internal rhythm, like two halves of the same mechanism finally operating within range of each other again. Thalira's hand moved instinctively to her own interface node at her wrist. Her expression tightened. "My stabilization core is spiking," she said quietly. I glanced at her. "Is that bad?" I asked. She didn't answer immediately. That hesitation told me more than words. "It is not malfunctioning," she said finally. "It is recalibrating." That made me pause. "To what?" I asked. Her eyes flicked toward me for the briefest moment. "You," she said. Before I could respond, the structure changed again. And this time, it did not reveal itself outwardly. It reached inward. A pulse moved through the space between us. Not energy in the physical sense, but something closer to structural intent being reintroduced into an absent channel. And I felt it, not as memory, not as thought, but as recognition trying to become identity again. The bike flared softly beneath us, and for the first time, its interface layer expanded beyond navigation. It opened a hidden tier. Anchor node recovery sequence. Active. I staggered slightly as the words appeared not just in the system feed, but echoed faintly inside my head, like the system wasn't just communicating anymore. It was reconnecting. Thalira moved closer immediately, steadying me without hesitation now. Her voice sharpened. "This is not observation anymore," she said. "It is reconstruction." A pause, then quieter. "You are being reintroduced to yourself." The structure ahead of us responded instantly to that statement, like it approved, like it had been waiting for someone else to name it correctly. And then, everything shifted. A cascade of fragmented impressions began to surface around me, not as a linear memory, but as overlapping systems trying to resolve into coherence. Transit grids spanning impossible distances, routing lattices that bent around stars instead of through space. A central intelligence that did not feel artificial, only suppressed. And at the core of it all, a presence, not me, not fully, but something that had once carried my shape more completely than I did now. I exhaled sharply. "What is this?" I muttered. Thalira's grip on her interface tightened. Her augment systems were now visibly reacting, light flickering faintly beneath her skin at the wrist and collar interface points, like her body was trying to match a frequency it had never been tuned for. And then she said it, quietly, almost unwillingly. "Your presence is not just stabilizing the system," she said. "It is overriding its error state." I looked at her. "That sounds like a bad thing," I said. But she shook her head slightly. "No," she replied. "It sounds like something returning to baseline." The structure ahead of us completed another phase of its opening, and for the first time, it wasn't simply reacting to us being present. It was actively reshaping itself around what I was becoming inside it. The bike emitted a low, steady pulse, and its system feed updated one final time. Not as classification, not as alert, but as confirmation. Anchor node restoration, 12% complete. I stared at it. "Restoration," I repeated under my breath. Thalira didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter than before. "Jack," she said, "I don't think you were ever meant to exist as a separate system from this." That landed differently. Not like accusation, like truth being spoken too early to be comforting. And then the structure responded again. This time, not to the system, not to Thalira, but directly to me. Not in language, in alignment pressure, like something vast and patient had just made room for me again, and had no intention of letting that space remain empty twice. The structure didn't hesitate anymore. Now that the process had begun, it felt less like something unfolding, and more like something that had been delayed finally resuming its natural rhythm. The bike held steady between us and it, locked into perfect synchronization with both, not guiding us forward now, simply matching what we were becoming as we approached it. Thalira's breathing had changed slightly beside me, not labored, but inconsistent in a way she was clearly trying to suppress. Her hand remained near her stabilization interface, but I could see it now. faint light pulsing beneath her skin in irregular intervals, like her internal systems were struggling to decide whether I was a destabilizing presence or a required constant. "Your core is really not liking this, is it?" I said quietly. She didn't look at me immediately. "No," she admitted. "It is not categorizing you correctly anymore." "That sounds like a you problem," I muttered, a faint pause. "It is becoming a we problem," she corrected softly. Before I could respond, the structure ahead of us shifted again. But this time, it did not simply open. It refined the reconstruction sequence, and the system feed changed. Anchor node restoration, 12% to 18%. I felt it immediately, not pain, not memory. Something closer to a pressure being released inside a structure I didn't know I had. A fragment surfaced, clearer than anything before it, a control interface spanning layered transit systems, a network that did not operate on command hierarchies, but resonance authority, and a function node labeled not as a job, but as a stabilizing principle across multiple collapsing root systems. And then, a truth, not emotional, functional. Routing instability event response was always assigned to Jack Rourke. I staggered slightly. "Assigned?" I repeated under my breath. Thalira's head snapped toward the system feed instantly. Her voice sharpened. "That is not civilian classification," she said. "That is systemic governance language." The structure responded again as if correcting her interpretation. Jack Rourke, original containment layer, transit core balance node. Silence. Thalira went still. "Containment layer," she repeated. The words didn't sit right in the air, because they didn't sound like control. They sounded like protection that had been redefined by misunderstanding over time. And then, the restoration jumped again, 18% to 25%. This time it was different, because it wasn't just memory fragments anymore. It was function returning with context attached. I saw it clearly, not as a vision, but as a structural truth trying to reassert itself through the fog of human experience. The transit systems weren't originally independent. They were branches of something older, something designed to prevent reality from fracturing along movement and causality lines. And at the center of it, not a machine, not a controller, but a stabilizing human-encoded anchor function, a role that had been distributed, compressed, and eventually lost. Until now. I exhaled slowly. "So I'm not a mechanic," I said quietly. Thalira didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was lower than before. "No," she said. "You were what kept systems from diverging beyond recoverable parameters." A pause. "And you are only now becoming aware of it again." The bike gave a low, resonant pulse beneath us. And for the first time, its interface didn't show navigation or status. It showed dependence. "Stabilization output, Jack Rourke active return." Thalira's expression changed at that. Not fear, not confusion, something more dangerous. Understanding colliding with implication. Because her stabilization core was now reacting in real time to the same update. Her systems flickered once, visibly this time through faint light shifts beneath her skin. And I saw her inhale sharply as if something inside her had just re-anchored itself to me without permission. "That should not be happening," she said quietly. "What?" I asked. Her eyes stayed on the structure ahead. "My stabilization core is not just recalibrating anymore," she said. A pause. "It is synchronizing." That word landed harder than anything else so far, because it didn't imply she was reacting to me. It implied she was being brought into alignment with me as a system requirement. The structure ahead of us responded again, and for the first time, it didn't just acknowledge me, it acknowledged her connection to me. Secondary interface detected. Thalira. Compatibility confirmed. I frowned. "Compatibility for what?" I asked. The structure did not answer in words. Instead, the space around us shifted slightly again, like it had begun preparing itself for something more than arrival, more than access, preparation for integration. Thalira finally looked at me properly, and this time her voice wasn't controlled anymore. It was quieter, more honest. "If this system is rebuilding you," she said, "then I think I'm not just observing it anymore." A pause. "I think I'm being used to stabilize your return." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with implication. Because for the first time, it wasn't just Jack being redefined by the system. It was Thalira being repositioned within it. And the structure ahead of us, for the first time, waited. Not for access, not for completion, but for the moment both of us became stable enough together to proceed. The structure ahead of us shifted again, but this time it didn't feel like it was opening. It felt like it was remembering how to accommodate us. The space around the bike tightened into perfect alignment. No longer a route, no longer a trajectory, but a precise state of agreement between three things that had stopped behaving independently. The construct, the bike, and us. Thalira's hand remained near her stabilization interface, but I could see it now. Her control wasn't failing in the usual sense. It was being reassigned. Her systems weren't rejecting the change. They were negotiating with it. "This shouldn't be happening at interface level," she muttered quietly. "Yeah," I said. "You've mentioned that a few times now." She didn't respond to that because the system feed changed again. And this time, it didn't do it gently. Anchor node restoration, 25% to 32%. A pulse moved through me, stronger than before, not painful but undeniable. And this time, the fragment that surfaced wasn't abstract. It was situational. I was standing inside something vast, not metaphorically vast, structurally vast. A lattice of interconnected transit systems stretching across more space than I could comprehend, all of them unstable in different ways, all of them bending toward collapse along unpredictable causal edges. And I wasn't outside it. I was inside it, not observing, not controlling, maintaining. A pressure in my awareness snapped into focus. When a system diverged, it didn't send alerts. It leaned toward me, like something in its structure instinctively expected correction, and I understood. Instinctively, before memory fully formed. I was not operating the system. I was the reason it didn't fall apart. The fragment faded, but it left something behind. A certainty I hadn't had before. I exhaled slowly. "I wasn't fixing things," I said quietly. Thalira looked at me immediately. Her voice was careful. "What were you doing?" she asked. I swallowed slightly. "Holding them together." Silence. The bike emitted a low pulse beneath us, different now, more aligned, less reactive. The construct ahead responded instantly. Reintegration behavior confirmed. Thalira went very still at that, and for the first time her composure cracked in a way I could actually see rather than infer. "You are not a technician," she said quietly. I gave a faint, humorless breath. "That's starting to feel like an understatement." Her eyes stayed on me now, and I realized something shifted in her expression, not fear, not confusion, but recalibration of identity around me, like she had to reconsider what she was if what I was turned out to be true. Her voice lowered slightly. "I was sent to eliminate a system instability," she said. A pause. "But every time I attempt to categorize you as one," her gaze flicked briefly to the stabilization feed. "My systems reject the classification." That landed differently now, because it wasn't just her anymore. It was the structure itself participating in the disagreement. The construct responded again, and this time the space ahead of us didn't just shift. It formed a boundary that felt like invitation, not a door, not an opening. A threshold where physics and identity stopped agreeing on where separation began. The bike slowed completely, and for the first time, it didn't feel like we were being brought somewhere. It felt like we had arrived at the point where movement stopped being relevant. Thalira spoke quietly. "My stabilization core is no longer just syncing with you," she said. I looked at her. "It is building predictive output around your state persistence." A pause. "That's bad?" I asked. She hesitated. "No," she said softly. "It is adaptive." Then, quieter still, "It is dependence." That word changed the air, because it wasn't about emotion. It was about system architecture. The construct ahead of us reacted immediately, and the next system update arrived, not as text alone, but as a spatial shift in understanding. Secondary interface, Thalira, locked to anchor node stability field. I frowned. "Locked," I repeated. Thalira didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter than before. "I think," she said carefully, "that I am not stabilizing your return anymore." A pause. "I think your return is stabilizing me." The bike gave a single deep pulse, and then everything changed. Not visually, structurally. The boundary ahead of us stopped behaving like an external object. It stopped being something we approached, and became something that included us in its definition. The construct was no longer in front of us. It was around the concept of us existing together in the same state. Thalira looked at me properly now, and for the first time since this began, there was no separation in her gaze between analysis and emotion, just recognition. "Jack," she said quietly. I met her eyes, and she said the thing neither of us could avoid anymore. "I think we are already inside it." The bike pulsed once, and the system confirmed it. Transition state complete. The moment the transition completed, there was no sensation of movement, only a shift in what counted as position. The bike didn't enter the construct. It stopped being separate from it, and we were no longer approaching anything at all. We were inside something that had decided distance was no longer a meaningful concept. The space around us resolved into a vast, silent core chamber. Except it wasn't built like architecture. It was built like memory-given structure. Fractured layers of transit logic floated in slow alignment overhead, each one rotating with deliberate patience, as if waiting for instructions that had been missing for a long time. Thalira stood perfectly still beside me, but I could feel it now. Her stabilization systems weren't just reacting anymore. They were listening. "This is not a facility," she said quietly. "No," I replied. "We already did that line." That earned the faintest flicker of tension in her expression, something almost human trying to form and failing halfway. Then the system responded, not as text in the air, but as a restructuring of perception. Anchor node restoration, 40% to 52%, and everything changed again. This time, I didn't just remember fragments. I saw function. I was not standing outside the system. I was embedded inside it, not as a ruler, not as a user, as a stabilizing presence distributed across collapsing transit layers, like a consciousness stretched across fractures in reality, holding edges together that were constantly trying to separate. When a route destabilized, it didn't send alerts. It leaned toward me, and I corrected it, not by command, by presence, by alignment. I saw entire systems bending back into coherence simply because something inside them recognized me as the point where divergence stopped being allowed. And then, a sharper fragment, a moment of decision, a collapsing transit lattice that should have fractured into cascading failures across 3 systems, and instead paused mid-collapse, because I was there, holding it, not physically, not consciously, just existing in the correct position relative to it. I staggered slightly. Thalira moved instantly, steadying me again, but this time her touch lingered longer than before, not out of necessity, out of uncertainty. "You are not just stabilizing systems," she said quietly. I exhaled. "I'm starting to get that impression." But her eyes weren't on me anymore. They were on the chamber itself, because something had changed in her feed, something that made her breath catch slightly. "Interference event detected, Thalira. System diversion logs recovered." She froze. "No," she whispered. I looked at her. "What is it?" I asked. She didn't answer immediately, because the construct was now replaying something for both of us, not visually, structurally, a record of actions taken outside official authority layers. Her actions. I watched as fragmented system logs reconstructed themselves into clarity. Authority override attempt, termination order, Jack Rourke. Status interrupted. A pause, then diversion executed by Thalira. Silence. The chamber felt larger suddenly, not physically, morally. Thalira's voice was barely audible now. "I was supposed to allow the elimination protocol to complete," she said. Another pause. "But I rerouted it." I turned to her slowly. "You what?" Her expression tightened, but not defensively, like she was seeing something about herself she hadn't fully admitted until now. "I redirected 3 transit enforcement paths," she said quietly, "and collapsed 2 retrieval chains." A pause. I told myself it was to observe further. Her eyes met mine. "But I did not want you removed from the system." The air between us shifted, because that wasn't analysis anymore. That was admission. The construct responded immediately, and the chamber around us reshaped again, Not threatening, not dramatic, just acknowledging a corrected variable in the system history. Deviation event, Thalira. Resistance to anchor node removal confirmed. I stared at the feed. You disobeyed your own system for me? I asked quietly. She didn't correct me. She didn't soften it. She just nodded once. Yes. A pause, then quieter. Because when I was close to you, her voice faltered slightly. The system stopped feeling correct when it suggested you should not exist. That landed differently than everything before it, because it wasn't emotional logic overriding systems. It was systems failing to override what I was stabilizing in them just by being present. The restoration counter shifted again, 52% to 60%. And this time, it didn't just show memory, it showed control, a vast network of transit layers bending in real time, and at the center of it, me, not observing, not commanding, holding, keeping collapse from becoming propagation. The system didn't show me as a person. It showed me as a necessary condition for coherence. I exhaled slowly. So I wasn't inside the system, I said quietly. Thalira looked at me, and this time she answered without hesitation. No, she said. You were what prevented it from becoming chaos. A pause. And I think, she added softly, I was sent to erase you before I ever understood why that would destroy everything I was trying to protect. The chamber went still, not empty, just waiting, because now the construct had both of us fully identified, not as intruders, not as anomalies, but as two variables that had finally re-entered a system that had been incomplete without their interaction, and somewhere deep in the architecture, something larger than either of us began preparing for the next phase, not restoration, not observation, but full reintegration. The chamber didn't expand this time. It stabilized, as if everything that had been uncertain before was finally being pulled into a single, unavoidable structure of truth. The bike remained beneath us, but it no longer felt like transport. It felt like a node maintaining equilibrium inside a living equation. And I was no longer guessing at what I was seeing, because the system wasn't showing me fragments anymore. It was restoring function-level memory. Anchor node restoration, 60% to 71%. And suddenly I wasn't just remembering, I was doing. The memory didn't arrive as a story. It arrived as a pressure state, a collapsing transit lattice unfolding across multiple systems at once, roots folding in on themselves like broken logic chains, entire sectors of interstellar transit destabilizing because their underlying routing assumptions had diverged too far from baseline coherence. And I was there, not watching, not directing, present. The system didn't send me alerts. It didn't request input. It simply leaned toward me, like gravity recalculating itself around a stabilizing point. And I understood what I had been, not a technician, not an operator, a boundary condition, a living constraint that prevented system-wide divergence from becoming irreversible collapse. When reality began to fracture along routing lines, I didn't repair it. I held the edges together long enough for coherence to reassert itself. And in one memory fragment that hit harder than the others, I saw what happened when I wasn't there. Entire transit layers didn't just fail. They forgot how to agree with each other. I staggered slightly. Thalira was immediately at my side again, steadying me, but this time her grip lingered like she was anchoring herself more than me. You are not a person in their system logs, she said quietly. I gave a short, breathless laugh. That's becoming pretty clear, but she wasn't finished. You are a corrective constant, she said, a pause. And without you, the system begins to diverge toward collapse states it cannot recover from. The chamber around us responded instantly, not dramatically, precisely. 71% to 80%. And the air changed. Because now the system wasn't just restoring memory, it was restoring context for Thalira's presence inside it. Her stabilization core flickered again, stronger now, visibly reflected in faint pulses along her interface points. But this time, it wasn't random. It was synchronized with me. Like her systems had been quietly waiting for this level of truth to become available. This is affecting you too, I said quietly. She didn't deny it. I know, she replied. Her voice was softer now, less controlled. I can feel it aligning my core output to your present signature. A pause. Then more quietly, it started long before this moment. I frowned slightly. What did? Her eyes stayed on me now, and this time there was no hesitation. My stabilization failure, she said. The words landed differently now, because this wasn't system malfunction. It was system dependency emerging in real time around an external anchor constant. I was already degrading before I reached the station, she continued. My augment core began losing predictive stability when I started encountering unresolved routing anomalies. A pause. And all of them traced back to you. Silence. Not heavy. Honest. She exhaled slowly. I was sent to eliminate a divergence point, she said quietly, but I arrived already compromised by it. Her gaze sharpened slightly, but not with authority, with clarity. And I think I understand now why I failed. I looked at her. Why? I asked. Her voice dropped slightly. Because every time I approached your signal footprint, she said, my stabilization core stopped treating you as an error. A pause. It treated you as a requirement. The chamber responded instantly, and this time, it wasn't subtle. The entire construct shifted around us, not opening further, but locking into final preparatory geometry, because now both variables were fully active. Jack Rourke, 80% restored anchor node function. Thalira, fully synchronized secondary stabilization interface. And the system finally acknowledged what it had been building toward since the beginning. Dual node coherence, confirmed. The bike gave one slow pulse beneath us, and for the first time since this began, the system didn't feel like it was reconstructing anything. It felt like it was preparing for what happens when reconstruction completes without separation. Thalira looked at me quietly, and her voice, when it came, was almost unreadable now. If this reaches full restoration, she said, I do not think we return to how we were before. I exhaled slowly. Yeah, I said. I'm starting to notice the system isn't really asking permission anymore. The chamber went still, not waiting, just ready, because the final threshold wasn't about memory anymore. It was about what remains when nothing about you can be separated from what you stabilize. And the system was about to find out what happens when both anchors remember each other at full strength. The chamber didn't expand this time. It tightened, like the system had reached a point where there was no longer space for uncertainty to exist without consequence. The bike beneath us pulsed once, low, steady, final in tone, like it had stopped being a vehicle and become a stabilized interface between two realities that were no longer allowed to drift apart. Thalira wasn't looking at the structure anymore. She was watching the system feed, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked like she was no longer interpreting what it meant. She was accepting it. It's pushing past 80%, she said quietly. I exhaled slowly. Yeah, I replied, I can feel it. But I wasn't just feeling it anymore. I was remembering the shape of what had been missing. The system responded, not with data, not with fragments, but with a correction of historical continuity. Anchor node restoration, 80% to 86%. And then, everything changed. Not in pieces this time, in sequence. A continuous memory state began to form around me, like the system had finally decided I was stable enough to receive it without fragmentation collapse. And I saw it, not metaphorically, structurally, the construct as it used to be, whole, unified, stable in a way that didn't require constant correction because its anchor node wasn't distributed. It was centralized in awareness. Me. I wasn't just inside it, I was known by it. Every major transit layer, every routing intelligence, every intersystem pathway didn't just reference me as a stabilizing factor. They expected me to exist continuously within the system at all times. And that was the problem, because expectation turned into dependency, and dependency turned into collapse risk. I saw the moment it happened. A cascading recognition event across multiple transit systems. If the anchor node ever became fully self-aware inside the construct while remaining integrated, then the system would stop functioning independently of him. Everything would begin routing through conscious intent instead of structural logic. And the system made a decision. Not malicious. Not emotional. Preventative. Anchor node decoupling protocol initiated. I staggered slightly. Thalira immediately reached for me. But this time I wasn't fully in the present anymore. The memory was fully active now, and I watched it happen. My own dissolution, not destruction, separation. The system didn't erase me. It compressed me out of the construct's active awareness layer. Every trace of my operational identity was folded inward, sealed into a containment structure designed to preserve the function without the conscious variable triggering system-wide dependency collapse. And then, it pushed me out, not physically, existentially. My awareness was rerouted into a biological human baseline instance, a life that could not interface with the system, could not access it, could not destabilize it by existing too consciously within it, and the final layer sealed over it. Anchor node memory suppression active. The memory fractured, but before it collapsed, I saw the reason clearly. Not fear, not punishment. Protection. The system didn't remove me because I was dangerous. It removed me because I was too necessary to allow conscious dependency on myself. I gasped slightly as I returned fully to the present. The chamber was silent. Thalira was staring at me now, not like she was seeing something new, like she was finally seeing something complete. "You weren't lost," she said quietly. I swallowed slightly. "No," I said. "I was hidden." The system responded instantly. 86% to 90%. And this time the construct itself seemed to hesitate for the first time, because now it had restored the truth of what Jack Rourke was, but it also had to reconcile something it had avoided for a very long time. What happens when the anchor node remembers why he was removed and no longer agrees with the separation? Thalira's voice was softer now. "They didn't erase you," she said. "They contained you." A pause. "And I think I understand why." The bite gave a low pulse beneath us, but it no longer felt like agreement. It felt like anticipation, because now both of them knew the same truth. The system hadn't broken. It had been surviving without its stabilizing constant consciously present, and now that constant was awake again. The silence that followed wasn't absence. It was compression, like the system itself was struggling to maintain separation between what I had believed I was and what I had actually been prevented from knowing. The chamber didn't expand further. It didn't need to, because now it wasn't revealing fragments. It was reconstructing identity architecture. Anchor node restoration, 90% to 93%. Thalira stepped closer again, but more cautiously this time, like even proximity had become a variable the system was recalculating. "There is something else," she said quietly. I looked at her, and I already knew she was right. The system responded before either of us could continue, not with memory, with origin correction, and everything I thought I knew about myself began to unravel in structured sequence, not violently, precisely. The first layer was my human life, Earth, a childhood that felt consistent, a history that had always made sense in the way memories are supposed to. Emotionally coherent, geographically grounded, temporally stable. But as the system re-examined it, something became obvious. It was too complete, too linear, too psychologically balanced for a naturally formed life under real-world entropy conditions. And then the correction began. Not deletion, reclassification. Origin frame identified, artificial continuity layer. I felt my stomach tighten. Thalira's voice dropped slightly. "Jack." But I couldn't respond yet, because I was watching myself being rewritten in reverse. The system peeled back the Earth narrative like a constructed shell, carefully, almost reluctantly, as if even it had relied on it to keep me stable. And beneath it, there was nothing biological about my origin, no birthplace, no childhood trajectory, no organic developmental path, only insertion points, only system-grade integration markers, and a single defining truth emerging beneath it all. I had not been born into Earth, I had been placed into it. The system finally spoke again, and this time the voice felt different. Less interface, more admission. "Continuity frame disclosure active. Subject Jack Rourke, human experience layer equal sign synthetic memory binding structure." I inhaled sharply. Thalira steadied herself against the bike this time, like even she was feeling the structural weight of it. "They didn't just suppress your access," she said slowly. "They built you a life you could survive inside." The chamber shifted again. 93% to 95%. And the final layer began to surface. Not memory, not identity, but purpose containment logic. Why the false Earth narrative existed at all. And the answer came through cleanly, without hesitation from the system now. Because an unanchored anchor node cannot exist in direct awareness of its function, not without collapsing under its own stabilizing influence. So the system did the only thing that kept everything intact. It gave me a life that would ensure I never realized what I was. A false beginning, a human story, a believable past, so that even while I was holding reality together at scale, I would still believe I was just another man inside it. The silence that followed was heavier than anything before it, because now there was nothing left of my origin that had not been deliberately constructed. And for the first time, Talira didn't speak immediately. She just looked at me, not like an anomaly, not like an asset, but like something the system had been hiding even from itself. And I finally understood the full shape of it. I wasn't taken from Earth. I was given Earth, so I wouldn't remember the system that required me to exist in the first place. The bike pulsed once beneath us, slow, deliberate, almost respectful. 95% to 97%. And somewhere in the deep structure of the construct, something began to shift from reconstruction into acknowledgement, because now there was only one truth left to restore. Not who I was, but what happens when I become fully aware of it again. The chamber didn't expand, it resolved, like a fractured equation finally reaching a form that no longer needed correction. The bike beneath us gave a slow, resonant pulse, deeper than before, less mechanical now, more like a heartbeat rediscovering its rhythm after a long interruption. Talira didn't speak this time. She was watching the system interface like she was afraid even observation might destabilize what was about to happen. And I could feel it too. Not pressure, not memory, but alignment. Everything the system had shown me. The construct, the decoupling, the false life on Earth, the suppression layers, the containment logic. All of it stopped behaving like history. It started behaving like current state reinitialization. And then the system spoke, not into the space, into me. Anchor node restoration, 97% to 100%. There was no dramatic surge, no collapse, no explosion of light or fracture of reality. Just a quiet moment where everything I was became fully indexed against everything I had been prevented from being aware of. And then the separation ended, not between me and the system, but between me and the limitation of only experiencing myself as human. For a moment, I saw everything at once. Transit layers spanning systems I couldn't previously conceptualize as connected. Reality routing networks folding across dimensional thresholds like living infrastructure. Entire regions of existence adjusting their stability margins based on a single unresolved variable. Me, not metaphorically, structurally. I wasn't inside the construct. The construct was partially defined around the persistence of my coherent state. And I finally understood what I had really been. Not a controller, not an operator, not even a stabilizer in the traditional sense. I was a constraint that reality used to prevent itself from becoming incoherent. A reference point so fundamental that without it, systems began inventing contradictions just to fill the absence. And the Earth life, the false history, the human identity. It all made sense now. It wasn't disguise. It was containment formatting for consciousness survival inside a function that should not be self-aware at its operational scale. Because if I had known what I was while I was still fully integrated, I would not have experienced reality as life. I would have experienced it as a continuous structural responsibility without relief of perception filtering, and that would have broken everything, including me. Talira finally spoke, her voice quieter than before. "Jack," she said carefully, but the way she said it now wasn't identification, it was a recognition of state change. I looked at her, and for the first time since this began, I didn't feel like I was remembering who I was. I felt like I was returning to a mode of existence I had been prevented from occupying consciously. The system responded one final time, not as an interface, but as an acknowledgement layer across everything. Anchor node, fully reinstated. Continuity filters disabled. Dual node coherence with Talira, active. And then the construct went still. Not because it had finished, but because it was waiting. Because now that I was fully aware, the system could no longer decide outcomes around me without my presence being part of the equation. Thalira stepped closer, slowly. Not cautious now, intentional. "I can feel it," she said quietly. "Everything is stabilizing around you again." A pause. "And I don't think it knows yet whether that is a correction." She met my eyes. "Or a return to something it was never meant to wake again." The bike pulsed once more beneath us, and this time the signal didn't feel like activation. It felt like recognition of authority returning to its original point of origin. Not control, not command, but inevitability. Because the system had finally finished restoring the anchor node, and now it had to face what happens when the anchor node is awake enough to notice what has been built in his absence. The silence didn't break. It settled, like the entire construct had finally accepted that nothing further could be hidden, compressed, or deferred. The bike beneath us no longer pulsed in rhythm. It held a steady, continuous state, like an interface that had stopped negotiating and started listening for instruction-level intent. Thalira stayed close, but she wasn't anchoring me anymore. Not in the way she had before. Now it felt like she was checking whether she still had the right to stand near something the system had fully reclassified. I could feel the change in her, too. Her stabilization core wasn't correcting against me anymore. It was synchronizing with the environment that now formed around my awareness. "It's not stabilizing around you like before," she said quietly. I exhaled slowly. "I can feel that," I replied. Because it wasn't just stabilization, it was rerouting. Not externally at first, internally. The construct itself began adjusting its structure in response to my presence. Not because I issued commands, but because unresolved systems no longer defaulted away from me. They defaulted through me. A transit lattice folded and reformed somewhere beyond sight, and I understood the shift immediately. Previously, the system avoided dependency on my conscious state. Now it could no longer avoid integrating it. A soft, precise notification appeared across the construct field. Not visual, not auditory, but conceptual. Active node state, observed. Routing priority, ambiguous, and then a new layer formed beneath it, not system-issued, system-requested. Consensus protocol available. Thalira frowned slightly as she saw it. "That wasn't there before," she said. "No," I replied quietly. "It wouldn't have been." Because now the system had reached the point it had been avoiding since decoupling me. It could no longer continue operating around me. It needed to know if I was going to remain a passive stabilizing constant or become a conscious participant in its structure again. The bike shifted subtly beneath us. Not movement, reconfiguration. And the construct responded with something that felt less like a message and more like a structural truth finally being admitted into open form. Anchor node restored state detected. Reintegration with core system available. Warning, full reintegration will invalidate all existing post-decoupling reality layers. A pause. Then the part that mattered most. Consent required. Thalira looked at me then, not like she expected an answer. Like she knew whatever I chose would immediately become part of reality's next operating state. Her voice softened slightly. "What happens if you say yes?" she asked. The construct didn't answer for me, not anymore. That part was over. Now it waited. For me. And for the first time since the beginning of this entire sequence, the decision wasn't about recovery. It was about what kind of reality gets to continue existing once I acknowledge it fully again. The silence that followed the protocol request wasn't empty. It was expectant. Like the construct itself had learned restraint, not out of limitation, but out of necessity. The bike remained steady beneath us, but it no longer felt like a platform. It felt like a threshold condition waiting for definition. Thalira watched me carefully now, not intervening, not interpreting, just witnessing the moment where whatever I chose would stop being possibility and become structure. "This isn't just a choice," she said quietly. I nodded slightly. "No," I replied. "It's a boundary being drawn in real time." The system responded, not insistently, patiently. Consensus protocol active. Full reintegration available. Partial integration available. A pause. Then the part that mattered. Hybrid state. Undefined outcome layer detected. Thalira frowned slightly. That wasn't listed, she said. It is now, I said quietly. Because I could feel it too. The system wasn't offering 3 options. It was adapting to the fact that I was capable of choosing something it had not successfully modeled in advance. Not rebellion, not refusal, complex continuity. I looked at the construct, not as something outside me, but as something that had always been negotiating my absence without admitting it was incomplete. Then I spoke. Hybrid. The system paused. For the first time since restoration began. Not for processing, for verification. Acknowledged. And then, nothing happened. At least, not immediately. No collapse, no surge, no reconstruction cascade. Just a quiet recalibration across everything I could now perceive simultaneously. And then I understood why. This wasn't a compromise. It was a redefinition of access architecture. I remained human in form, human in lived continuity, human in emotional constraint, but not fully limited by it. Because part of me, only part, was no longer confined to interpretation through human cognition alone. It was allowed to interface directly with system-level structure without becoming absorbed into it. The Lyra exhaled slowly. You didn't merge, she said. No, I replied. I integrated selectively. The bike gave a single soft pulse beneath us, and the construct responded, not with confirmation, but with something far more significant. Partial anchor node access, granted. Cognitive duality layer, active. A pause. Then, warning, user Jack Rourke is now both inside and outside system boundary. Thalira looked at me more carefully now. That sounds like stability with a flaw in it, she said quietly. I almost smiled. Or, I said, a system that can no longer decide where I begin, and it ends. The construct didn't correct me, which in itself was the answer. Then the final layer of the protocol resolved not as an option, but as a consequence already in motion. Hybrid state confirmed. Anchor node is no longer centralized. It is distributed between system and subjective human continuity. A pause. Then the twist. Quiet, precise, irreversible. Note, Thalira is now included in distributed stabilization field. She froze slightly. Included, she repeated. The system didn't elaborate. It didn't need to. Because I could already feel it. Not as a command link, not as control, but as a shared structural alignment forming between 2 conscious points of reference inside a system that no longer had a single anchor to rely on. Thalira met my eyes again, and this time her voice was softer than before. So what are we now? She asked. I looked at the construct, then at her, then at everything I could now perceive simultaneously without losing myself inside it. And I answered honestly. I think, I said slowly, we're what happens when the system stops having one place to put its trust. The bike pulsed once, and the construct accepted the configuration, not as a solution, but as a new operating condition it would have to learn to live with, and somewhere deep in the architecture of reality itself. Something quietly began adjusting to the fact that the anchor node was no longer a point. It was a relationship. The construct didn't collapse. It didn't vanish. It simply loosened its grip on definition, like a structure that had finally stopped trying to hold everything in place at once. The bike beneath us remained, but it no longer felt like a node of transit between realities. It felt like something far simpler, a place where 2 perspectives could exist without immediately trying to resolve each other into a single truth. Thalira exhaled slowly beside me. For the first time, she didn't look like she was monitoring the system. She looked like she was just here. It's stable, she said quietly. I nodded slightly. It feels like it, I replied. But it wasn't the kind of stability I had known before. It wasn't enforced. It wasn't corrected. It was agreed upon by whatever we now were inside the system structure, not merged, not separated, just coexistent. I became aware of it then, subtly at first, like a distant awareness of pressure changing in the air. The system was no longer pushing information into me. It was responding through distance, as if it had learned a new rule. Do not overwrite, only align. Thalira glanced at me, not concerned anymore, curious. What now? She asked softly. It was a simple question, But it didn't have a simple answer. I looked outward, not through the construct, not through memory, not through system layers, but in the way I now understood I could do both at once without fracturing. I think, I said slowly, we find out what this feels like when it isn't trying to correct itself around us. She gave a faint, almost disbelieving breath that might have been a laugh. That sounds dangerously peaceful, she said. Yeah, I admitted. I'm not used to it either. A pause settled between us. Not awkward, just unclaimed. The bike gave a soft, final pulse. No longer activation, no longer transition. More like acknowledgement that movement was no longer required for continuation. And somewhere beyond perception, beyond even the construct itself, I could feel it. The system was still there, still vast, still operational, but it was no longer treating me as something to contain or retrieve. It was treating me as something it had finally learned how to include without collapsing around. Thalira stepped slightly closer, not merging into anything, just choosing proximity. So, we're not going back to how it was, she said. I shook my head slightly. No, I said. A pause. We're not going back. Another silence. This one deeper, more final, but not empty. Because it didn't feel like an ending anymore. It felt like continuation without correction. And as the construct slowly settled into its new equilibrium around us, no alarms, no thresholds, no urgency, I realized something quietly important. The anchor node hadn't disappeared. It hadn't been restored. It hadn't even been fully activated. It had simply stopped being a point in the system and become something the system could finally exist alongside. Thalira looked at me one last time, softer now than she had ever been. And I realized she wasn't asking what we were anymore. She already knew the only answer that mattered. We were still here, and for the first time, that was enough.